Can admiration and disgust coexist? That'll be a question on my mind as I discuss with my guest Hymn to Shanghai by Lin Yutang. So Hymn to Shanghai is a hymn to the Old Shanghai, and my guest is a guy who is, somewhat interested with the Old Shanghai. It's Paul French, author of City of Devils, A Shanghai Noir, and lots of other amazing books about Old Shanghai and Old China. So he's the guy I'll be interviewing, and Lin Yutang's the author we're going to be talking about. First, a really quick piece of promo for the show's Patreon. So I've got a new episode coming out today. It's coming out 1/2 of an hour after I'll be done recording this intro. And by the time I've uploaded this episode, it'll already be out. And that's an episode on Han Han's 1988, I Want to Talk with the World. And I really enjoyed reading it. And the Patreon episode is just me for a significantly long amount of time just waffling on and on about it. So if you like the kind of more solo, if you like the solo episodes I do, and if you just enjoy hearing my thoughts on the translated Chinese books I've read, the Patreon is for you, because that's basically what it is. There's another episode lined up for next week that's a similar just kind of train of thought, impressions upon reading a book. And the book I'll be talking about is Last Quarter of the Moon by TrChFic. Although I should say, both of these books are ones I'm planning to do normal episodes on, but the Patreon I'm kind of formulating my thoughts in advance. So that's there if you're interested and would like to help out the show. Of course, there's hours and hours of other stuff up there too. There's a whole special interview episode I did with the translator Dylan Levi King, and there's quite a few different Chinese sci-fi episodes there too. But yeah, enough promo, enough of me trying to lure you into paying me some money via Patreon. Let's get on to the TrChFic news. So our first news item, it is about Chinese sci-fi. I just can't stop talking about it, can I? So a friend of the show, Yen Ui, she got a little article up in the Science Fiction Research Association's website. It's kind of like an open access article for you guys to read. It's called Chinese Science Fiction, a Genre of Adversity. And she basically talks about some of the kind of forces or barriers that Chinese science fiction has come up with in original Chinese in China and in translation. It's an interesting read. It's not too long and it's not too short. And Yen is, an awesome individual. And it's an interesting one for me because one of the sources cited here is the discussions that were had at that genre fiction conference I went to way back in October of last year, which feels like a lifetime ago, but that's neither here nor there. So there's lots of different Chinese sci-fi authors discussed in that article. Han Song, Liu Cixin, Chen Shufan, Xia Jia, I believe, loads of interesting stuff. So if Chinese sci-fi is your bag and you like reading second-order things about it, go check out Yen's article. Now, the second news item, if you like Chinese sci-fi, well, you probably already know this and you don't need the news update, but I'm going to inject some of my own opinions and predictions. So this one is about three-body problem. You probably already heard. It looks like a visual adaptation of Three Body is finally going ahead, and after changing hands, I think, from Chinese film studios to Amazon, it's ended up in the hands of Netflix. And it looks like they've got writers too. It's the so-called D&D from Game of Thrones, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. So I suppose if you read it online, it's hard to not see someone expressing kind of worries that they're going to blow it like some people feel they blew Game of Thrones. The kind of mitigating factor is Liu Cixin, the author, has given his approval, and Ken Liu and I think Liu Cixin are going to be on board as like advisors or something. So that could be a really great production. It could be an amazing adaptation. It could be quite different from the books. Who knows? My prediction here about something we might see is drama. I saw someone with a tweet that was going viral, getting retweeted a lot. Some guy thought he would @ Liu Cixin's Twitter account and challenge him as to why he seemed to endorse what's going on in Xinjiang. the mass internment camps for the Uyghur and Muslim populations, and he'd kind of said in a passing remark that he thinks that's all right within China. And I think as we see more kind of these productions that link Chinese media and culture, and by Chinese I mean like PRC, from the People's Republic of China, with the Western or English-speaking world, I think we're going to see more stuff like this. We're seeing it with the Disney Mulan film too. I think it's just an interesting thing, because if you'd been following Liu Cixin, you would have known that he's had, this is what he believes. This is nothing new. But I think a whole new range of people in these Western audiences I think there's going to be a gradual realization that, people in the Chinese literary or media world might have beliefs that you as a Western consumer find disturbing. And I'm for better or for worse, I think we're going to see more of these challenges and interactions and questioning. If there's one thing I hope, it's that Liu Cixin won't get himself into trouble inside China. But yeah, I've already injected enough of my opinions, so let's go on to the last piece of TrChFic news. This one's nothing to do with sci-fi and nothing to do with politics, pretty much. Actually, no. I think that the book itself does, but I have nothing spicy to say about this, and it's not about the present. This is a book I just found by looking for basically going on Twitter and looking for something to put in this news slot, and I saw a little tweet thread from Nick Admeson, who I seem to be consistently finding things to talk about from his tweets. Must be kindred spirits in some ways. But during the hashtag scholar strike that's been going on, he decided to fill the time with some reading. And the book he picked up, it's only from 2 years ago. It's called Reading Lu Xun Through Carl Jung. And it's basically taking Carl Jungian therapeutic lens to Lu Xun's writings. And at first I thought, oh, that seems like a really random mishmash. But I read some info about the book. I read Nick's kind of tweets about it, and it seems to actually be something of a match made in heaven. So, I mean, I love Lu Xun, I love Carl Jung. I'm going to get this book. So this isn't news per se. This is a book that came out 2 whole years ago, but I don't care. It's my damn podcast, and if I want to do 2-year-old news, I will. So yeah, that's the end of our news segment for this episode. Let's go on and hear what Paul French has to say about Lin Yutang. So we've got on the show Paul French. Paul, it is fantastic to have you on. How's it going over at your end?
Not bad. I've managed to keep busy throughout lockdown, so I can't complain too much.
Yeah, likewise, I suppose. For listeners who are not familiar with you, can you tell us a wee bit about yourself and what you do?
Ooh, okay. Well, I've been quite fortunate in life in that when I was 18, which is quite a long time ago now, I sort of took up East Asian studies and Chinese history and, of course, Chinese language, and then ended up spending nigh on 20 years in Shanghai, living always in Shanghai, but of course traveling a lot to Beijing and Hong Kong and around China. So I spent a lot of time in both Beijing and Shanghai throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And then eventually, for various reasons, I left China in 2013 and came back to the UK, though I revisit China, well, until this year, usually twice a year. So I guess, I was working for a long time, running a market research publishing company in Shanghai, which was kind of fun. And then someone came along, which was even more fun, and bought it, which freed me up around the same time as a book that I'd written. I'd written several books before, but a book that I'd written called Midnight in Peking actually kind of did very well. I was very fortunate and people really liked it. It got a few awards and was a New York Times bestseller, and that was all quite amazing. And that happened at a time when I was being freed from the daily shackles of going to the office. And so I kind of have managed since then to be kind of a professional historian, raconteur, writer on China, and I've written a lot more. And then eventually the book I really wanted to do, which was the Old Shanghai book I did, which was a book called City of Devils. That was really about all the foreign gangsters, largely in Shanghai in the 1930s and through to the Second World War.
Right.
And that again did quite well. So I've been very lucky.
I have to ask you before we go on to the next section, When you were living in Shanghai, what districts or district were you living in?
I lived most of my time in. So now, of course, I tend to, and I always do think of Shanghai in the old ways because it's sort of how I'm working on all the time. I lived in what would have been the old external Western roads out at Xinhualu and Dingxilu, which now, when I go back, is quite sort of jazzed up. Yuyuanlu and around Zhongshan Park is all very jazzed up. It wasn't then. It was reasonably basic, and we used to be able to walk around. If you go along Xinhualu, there's the beautiful houses around Columbia Circle, and then up at the top there is J.G. Ballard's old house and so on. I used to spend a lot of time around there, and there weren't so many foreigners in Shanghai in the 1990s, and there certainly weren't so many people living there. And then the last few years that I lived in Shanghai, I had this kind of crazy belief that as the subway grew and grew, foreigners would go and live in all sorts of areas that they hadn't lived in before, sort of north of Suzhou Creek, basically, which has sort of historically been terra incognita for foreigners. That didn't happen, actually. They seemed to all more concentrate in areas of the French concession, like about 3 streets, really. So I thought that was a bit boring, and I got a place over in what was the former sort of Jewish ghetto because I wanted to do a lot of research over there, and lived there for a couple of years, and again around Dalianlu, and again that was reasonably not remote, but I mean it was off the sort of Laowai grid at that time. But it was very interesting to be able to explore a lot of that area, really, building by building around the former Jewish ghetto and Tilanchao, and when the prison was still operating there. And of course, since then, as all across Shanghai, bits and pieces of Hongkou, Tilanchao, Yangpu particularly have been kind of smashed. But so it was a good time to kind of grab the last few years of that as an intact district, which it's not now. So it was kind of interesting living over there. And of course, what do I know? My prediction that everyone would live everywhere because the subway would allow you to move around easily just didn't happen. There were lots of places north of Suzhou Creek that I think are really interesting. And I write about that area a lot, the former Little Tokyo and out to kind of the Jewish ghetto area and so on. So I'm always kind of, advocating for it.
Yeah, I have a few happy memories exploring up there. When you said the Laowai grid, I immediately knew what you meant. As fun as the Laowai grid was when I was living there, it was very easy to escape it. It just took the slightest hop over the 1-inch barrier into some, the unfamiliar streets. Speaking of unfamiliar streets, let's hop in our podcast time machine and head back into Jazz Age, Art Deco Age, Shanghai. So before I ask you anything about the author or the story we've picked for this episode, I think it would be fun to just do some old Shanghai focused questions, since you are Paul French, the old Shanghai City of Devils guy. So old Shanghai has come up on the show a few times, and maybe most prominently when I did Lin Yutang's Lust Caution. Did that quite early on, an early episode. And then more recently, I had an episode on the Book of Shanghai from Comma Press, which was lots of translated short stories that are all about Shanghai, but they're all about a lot of them are in modern Shanghai, to be fair, but generally speaking, they're all about very different versions of Shanghai, be it in time, place, class, or genre. So if there's anything I've learned about Shanghai, is it's a very multi-dimensional sort of place. I already knew that, but the podcast has really emphasized that for me. So in our story, or maybe our piece or our poem or whatever we're calling it for this episode, Hymn to Shanghai, the version or the dimension of Shanghai we're getting is really, really suited to your sort of focus. It's a very City of Devils Shanghai. And some of the listeners are going to know exactly what that means, and others, I think, are just sitting there guessing. So can you relay this vision of Shanghai to the uninitiated?
Well, I suppose the Shanghai I'm talking about is really, and that Lin Yutang is talking about in this piece, is really between the wars, the period between the world wars. Shanghai is, of course, a treaty port. It is divided into the international settlement and the French concession. Now, it's important to understand that although we often refer to Shanghai at this period as colonial, it wasn't technically a colony. So perhaps semi-colonial is a better term for it. Anyway, it is. It's not a colony in the way that Hong Kong or Singapore were colonies of the British. It is an international settlement, and within that, it has a system called extraterritoriality or extrality, which is a bizarre sort of system whereby you as a foreigner in an area are not governed by the laws of the country that you're in, China, to all intents and purposes. You are governed by the laws of your own country. And that, of course, leads to all sorts of complications and mix-ups and makes it very complicated. But you basically have an international police force, international justice systems. You have a organization, the municipal council, which is run by, effectively elected by the ratepayers, who until sort of the late 1930s did not include the Chinese in Shanghai, but did include all the other nationalities. So it's a hybrid sort of place. There aren't many examples of this sort of place in history. The closest would probably be, well, for a while, Constantinople, it's now Istanbul, perhaps better known Tangier, although that was the sort of more of a protectorate than, this was the Shanghai, of course, was protected by the Royal Navy, the French Navy, the American Navy, and the Marines, and various regiments were stationed there. So it was an interesting place. Yet it is a contradiction, because it is a treaty port that is ripped from China by violence and aggression in the Opium Wars. And Britain decides that this is one of the places they want to take as a treaty port because they can enforce the unequal treaties on the Qing dynasty, and they do. Very good reason for it. For Shanghai, always, of course, geography is destiny. It's the head of the Yangtze. Everything in, everything out goes through Shanghai, and there's a lot of commissions and money to be made on that business. And controlling it, of course, means you can control the trade. So it is these things. It is colonial in the sense that it is ripped from China. It is forced from them at gunpoint. And yet it becomes a refuge, a sort of port of last resort for so many people, primarily for Chinese people, who are fleeing, warlordism, the Taiping Rebellion, flood, famine, disease, everything you can imagine, and come to Shanghai where there maybe is opportunity. It then, of course, receives 25, 30,000 Russian exiles after the Bolshevik Revolution, the so-called White Russian, the Russian emigres who come and settle in the city. In the late 1930s, it receives another 20, 25,000 Jewish refugees from Europe who are fleeing fascism. So it becomes, and along the way, of course, as you'll know if you've read anything by me, because of this bizarre legal system there and so on, and it also being the only place in the world, which is why so many Russians and Jews came there, that you didn't need to have passport or an entry visa or even declare your real name. And the only place in the world where you could do that, Casablanca is an invention of Hollywood. It's only really Shanghai. It, of course, attracted many people that were on the run from their own legal systems, gangsters, basically. So Shanghai is this contradiction. It is a place that is created in violence and yet does so much to save various groups of people and allow them to prosper. And becomes this repository of East and West culture, which I know you've talked about before on your show. And it's more complicated than just East and West. It is, these refugee Jews, these refugee Russians, different groups of Chinese coming in. And the most important thing as well, I think, to think of at this time, certainly by the 1930s when Lin Yutang writes his hymn to Shanghai, is we're talking about the world's fourth largest city. London, Paris, New York, and then it's a tie between Berlin and Shanghai. Though of those 4 or 5 cities with massive populations at this time, Shanghai is by far the most densely populated and also by far the most cosmopolitan and international of these cities, at least in terms of numbers of people. So I think this is kind of the fascinating contradictions of Shanghai. And if you want to understand what Lin Yutang and others who are writing about Shanghai at this time are talking about, you have to understand this kind of this massive contradiction between Shanghai as a colonial possession and Shanghai as a refuge.
About every 30 seconds there through the story of Shanghai you were giving me, I was thinking of something from my experiences in modern day Shanghai that echoed this kind of amazing past. I'll just go for one. It was kind of a strange trip I did. I'd done this kind of trip going up to northern China, looking across the North Korean border, going through Korea, going through Japan, and then I decided to get the boat back from Japan, which was kind of a bad choice because it was 2 nights on my own, which was very dull. But the end of the trip was fantastic because the boat went right up the Yangtze until it got to the ferry dock. So we got this kind of very slow view of both sides of the city, so Puxi and Pudong. and you could see all these different kind of levels of development and layers of history. And a thing that really struck me was pretty early on, the boat went past quite a lot of, I guess, Chinese Navy warships. And maybe that's like the really big difference, is that before you couldn't particularly say who owns this place. It's divvied up in such a strange way, whereas now it is at least it's in Chinese hands, if we can say it's a Chinese city. But yeah, I'm starting to waffle here. My next question is probably one you've kind of already answered, but what draws you to the kind of city of devils incarnation of Shanghai? Is it more than just the contradictions that make you interested in it?
Well, I do think Shanghai was a fascinating city. And if you come at it from looking at it, trying to understand it as a Chinese city in a peculiar situation, a unique situation, if you try to understand it in terms of the foreigners who were living there and what they were trying to do there, in all ways, it's a fascinating city. And then that fusion between the two. And of course, what creates so much of what you saw on your boat trip as you were coming up the river is sort of interesting. And also the fact that, again, the geography defines things. So, if you look at Shanghai, it's an odd city, given that it has a major river running through it. Now, this is a really important thing for a successful city, having rivers run through them. I mean, Beijing is one of the few sort of major cities in the world that doesn't have a river running through it, because, of course, it was a sort of Mongolian camel camp back in the day that sort of grew and grew and grew. It always annoys people in Beijing, but that's kind of what it was. Grew wonderfully, but it started off that way, so it wasn't next to a river. Most other people would build next to a river, except, of course, the international settlement didn't really have control over the other side of the river, what is now Pudong. Putting aside all of the canards about it was just a fishing village in Pudong and there was nothing ever there, which is all nonsense. And it's a good way to tell if someone is BSing when they tell you about Shanghai. If they say they were ever in Shanghai, looked across the river and there was nothing but farmland, they're just telling you lies. Or they're 180 years old.
Oh, someone has lied to me then.
Oh, yeah. It still goes on. I'm having an argument with someone just today, actually, who maintained that when they got to Shanghai in like 2003 or something, Pudong was just a fishing village. And you're like, well, there may not have been as much there as there is now, but it was never a fishing village. If you look back at Shanghai, of course, Shanghai before treaty port days was a walled city. And of course, you can still see the original old city there, Nantao and so on. And it was a walled city. The wall, sadly, is pretty much gone. In fact, now most of the old city is pretty much gone, which is tragic. But you can see it and you can still clearly identify the route that the wall took. Now, why was it walled? Well, of course, like a lot of cities along that coast, towns and cities along that coast, it was walled against the Japanese pirates that raided along that coast. So why would the city of Shanghai be walled and then there'd just be a fishing village over in Pudong? It doesn't even make any sense, right? Anyway, you can see, Shanghai extended to the west. Go from the Bund and go up the Yan'an Expressway, what was the Avenue Edward VII, and go all the way up that. And of course, it runs out to the west, out towards Hongqiao and so on. What it doesn't have, unlike most other cities that are built on rivers, is until more recently, any bridges across it. Right? Which is sort of odd. I mean, how many bridges are there across the Thames or the Seine or the Neva or into and out of Manhattan and so on? There really was for many, many years only really the one bridge, and now there's a couple more, but there's still none in the center. It didn't develop that way, which if you think about it is a bit odd, right, compared to most other cities that are built on rivers. And now, of course, you can tunnel under it a million times rather than have bridges. But it's kind of interesting that, you don't look out from the Bund and see 5 bridges down around the curve of the river there, right, in the way that you would do at pretty much any point along the Thames or the Seine or most major rivers. So again, now I'm waffling away from your point, but yes, the layers of history are there. It always used to fascinate me. If you stood on the Bund, which of course now really is raised, then you could look across. You would see who was looking which way, and invariably the Chinese, the internal tourists who were there visiting would look across at Pudong, particularly in more recent last 15 years or so. Right. They would look across at Pudong and that would speak to them of all sorts of things about the China that they live in. Tourists and me, really, and a few others would sort of gaze the other way and wonder, about those buildings and what was there. course, the Bund itself the Bund itself is sort of fascinating, in that back in the sort of 1980s, when I was first in Shanghai and then in the 1990s living there, it was dark. I mean, it really, they didn't light it up at night. That no one was really encouraged to go there. There weren't really any businesses there or anything. Most of those buildings were empty, or at least subdivided up a million times with different families. We used to be able to go around the back streets there on what is now off the back of Guangdonglu and various other, and climb up the fire escapes at the back and get onto the roofs of those buildings in an almost sort of Batman-like thing. I remember an Armenian guy that came to Shanghai very early and opened a tango club up there, and he used to tango up on the roof with various people. And you could literally sit up there with some cans of Qingdao, or even worse, Reeb, and kind of smoke your cigarettes and look across at them building the Pearl Oriental Tower, wondering what the hell that was going to look like when it was finished. And that's not that long ago.
No.
The government really didn't bother much with the Bund. So things like that have changed massively. Even if when you go past, you think to yourself, quite rightly, there is that kind of old Shanghai, the majestic sweep of the Bund along the river, and on the other side, this incredible kind of Manhattan skyline that's been built. And that's a very obvious way of thinking about it. And then you think to yourself, wow, what really was underneath that Manhattan skyline? What was the old Pudong? What was there? And the answer is quite a lot, but not very high level. And what was on, why was the Bund so downplayed in terms of history? I mean, I remember going to a person's leaving party. I don't know if this is interesting to people, maybe it is. I remember going to someone who'd been a teacher for a while who was leaving in about 1993. And the thing they did on their last night after 2 years in Shanghai was go down to the Bund, right? Because they'd nenever been in the 2 years that they were there, because they'd never seen a reason to go there. There wasn't anything to do when you got there, right? So like they didn't go. Now I imagine it's probably where, obviously I know it's where people go first off, right? And all of the luxury shops and the restaurants and hotels that have gone in there. I mean, it's all so much later.
When I was living in China, my mum visited not once but twice, and we went by the Bund both times. And the second time, it was that was the only place she wanted to be. That was that and other hotels. Yeah,
I mean, I have to give a shout out to Michelle Garneau there for M on the Bund. I mean, and I remember she started off doing a sort of a guest residency really at the Majestic Hotel. Not the Majestic Hotel, sorry, we're coming on to talk about the Majestic Hotel. At the then called the Peace Hotel, of course, formerly Sir Victor Sassoon's Cafe Hotel, and now having gone through another refurbishment. At this point, it wasn't as spruced up as it is now. And she obviously decided she liked it, and then went on and took the premises she has at what is she at, 3 or 4 Bund. So it was kind of she kind of got things rolling a little bit down there, and then property developers got in and started rejuvenating some of the buildings down there. But I mean, a lot of it is really quite recent, certainly 21st century.
No, I never would have known these things if you hadn't told me. Last Old Shanghai question. This is again, maybe one we've already partly answered, but for you, do other episodes or places in Chinese or world history compare with what we saw in this Old Shanghai, maybe in other Chinese concession cities?
Well, I think that we probably obsess about Shanghai. I know I certainly obsess about Shanghai, although I admit that there are other reasons to be obsessed about Shanghai. Its rejuvenation is fascinating. Its dialect is fascinating. Its cuisine is fascinating. Its musical heritage is fascinating. Its general embrace of modernity. If, like me, you are someone who loves modernism in all of its forms around the world, I don't know, from Joyce to Lao She or something, right? Then, Shanghai is a very important city. We can talk a little bit about the impact of modernism and, the more showy parts of modernism like Art Deco and the more deeper intellectual parts of that. But I think, Tianjin, the old Tianjin, probably doesn't get quite as much attention as it should. And there's been a lot. There was obviously so much that went on in Tientsin. It was a slightly smaller sister to Shanghai, a treaty port, of course, but again has its own fascinating history, being effectively the port for Beijing. It's kind of a fascinating city and has gone through its own specific renaissance. And in terms of heritage and preservation, there's quite a lot that's gone on there, good and bad, in Tientsin. So we probably should think about that more. The other smaller treaty ports are all fascinating to visit. Xiamen and Fuzhou and various other places. But Shanghai is, of course, the big beast of the treaty ports. It was where the bulk of the money was made. And by the time that Lin Yutang's writing in the mid-1930s, of course, everything is, the capital is just up the road at Nanjing. Shanghai is really where the money is, to a slightly lesser degree, Tianjin. And Peking, well, Beijing is by this point really an intellectual center, a place where there's lots of interesting people gathering, Chinese culture, Chinese religion, as well as the sort of foreign aesthetes, the Harold Actons and Desmond Parsons and Lawrence Sickmans and all of those people who are fascinating. They are drawn to Beijing. And the money and the jazz and all of that is concentrated in Shanghai.
Yeah, and we might come back a bit to contrasting those two mega cities later in the episode. So we're going to march on from Old Shanghai to the man, Lin Yutang himself. So yeah, you mentioned that we covered Haipai on the show before, and that was mostly in the Book of Shanghai episode with Karen Wang. We kind of touched on it, but there's definitely, I think, more we could say about that. We've already kind of used the term a little bit, and I think it's probably going to come up when we talk about Lin Yutang. So my first question about him is, who was this Lin Yutang? What's he got to do with Shanghai, and what's he got to do with Haipai, the cultural mixing of Eastern and Western things?
Lin Yutang's originally from Fujian, but he comes to Shanghai to study at the St. John's University, which was out now, the Shanghai Political and Economic University, I think it is, just by Zhongshan Park, the old Jesfield Park to the west of the city. He studies there. He then goes to America, as so many intellectuals, Chinese intellectuals did at that time, to study at Harvard, I think. He comes back and spends a lot of time in Shanghai and really becomes a kind of, I don't really like this idea of saying, a Chinese person is sort of, the Chinese version of this person, but it maybe helps people get into their head who this sort of person is. I think he becomes almost like a kind of Joseph Roth of China. He writes these shorter pieces, essays. He's thinking a lot about the political situation, but he's also thinking about culture. He's thinking about things in China. He's thinking about he writes about the concept of face, the concept of manners. Humor. He thinks a lot about the notion of humor in China, and he thinks about Confucius. We're going through another cycle of this now, but he thinks about Confucianism and what it means for nationalist China, and he thinks about love. He thinks, which again is something a lot of people are writing on at the moment. He thinks about concepts of love and so on. He is, if you like, somewhat of a dandy. He is somewhat of a stylist, which I think makes him appeal to me. He is, I think if I had to describe him, I'd say he is a liberal cosmopolitan, and that draws him somewhat to Shanghai. His politics are liberal. He is at times sympathetic towards the emergent Communist Party. He is at times critical of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. He's a liberal. He sits somewhere in between. He interacts in Shanghai with a lot of the left-wing writers, Lu Xun, Ba Jin. Ba Jin, now of course considered a left-wing writer, was really more of just an anarchist back in the day, and others that are there. And so I think if I compared him with anyone, I would think of him within China more in line with Lao She, perhaps, who he was friends with and did publish, and as well as some overseas Chinese writers. One that I've talked about a lot because we did a blue plaque to him in Oxford last year, Chiang Yi, the artist and poet who was living in London at this time. But someone who wrote about, sort of the world through a Chinese lens, if you like. And we don't have many writers that did that. Xiao Qian, Traveler Without a Map, Qiang Yi, the Silent Traveler series, and many of the essays of Lin Yutang, his kind of How to Live, the Chinese Way of Life, that books that were around subjects like that are very interesting. And later on, he left China in 1936, went to America and became throughout the Second World War, became a great interpreter of China to the rest of the Western world at a time when China was, of course, an ally in the struggle against fascism and Japanese militarism. So he's also someone I think is quite important to understand who never really takes a strident position. I mean, we live in an era now, and it was like this in the 30s, where people felt they had to take a very strident position.
Really? I hadn't noticed.
Yeah. And anyone who was against you or took a different position was just there to be, at best, shouted down, at worst, taken out and shot. Right. So he comes at a time then, a little bit like the time that we seem to be in at the moment, where people took a very strong position, and he never does that. So, for instance, he had been raised largely in a Christian tradition as well as a Confucian tradition. And at times in his life, right through to the end of his life, he went to America for a long time and then eventually died in Taiwan. And if you go to Taipei, his house in Taipei now is a museum, complete with his library, which you can get up close and have a good look at. I've taken lots of pictures of his bookshelves in Taipei, and he's buried at Yangmingshan Cemetery in Taipei as well. But all his life, he kind of, rejected Christianity, and then at various times came closer again to Christianity, which is partly infuses this hymn to Shanghai. At times, he feels himself drawn to the left of politics. At times, he feels himself drawn back to the right of politics. At times, he feels himself very nationalistic. At other times, he feels himself very kind of critical of Chinese society and culture. And in his writing style, he sometimes wants to become, almost kind of fancy free in his stylings and his writings, and almost becomes ephemeral. And at other times he wants to be absolutely spot on and make his point and be quite critical. So he's not someone, and perhaps this makes him harder to grab hold of, and why he hasn't had quite the renaissance that he perhaps deserved compared to other writers of that period, is that he doesn't sit easily in one camp or another. So, for instance, no one in China now is quite sure what to do with Lin Yutang. Well, a lot of people in the West who want to take a very strong position about cultural appropriation and various other things, they're not quite sure what to do with Lin Yutang either, because at times he embraces the idea of cultural appropriation and mixing and mashing and fusion and blending, and at other times he walks it back, if you like, and finds himself drawn more towards away from the Shanghai High Pai, more towards the kind of Beijing Jing Pai of getting back to the essentials of Confucianism and opera and the classics. And he was very influential in introducing the Chinese classics to Western audiences as well. So that's one of the things that makes him very interesting, is that he isn't someone who's very easy to stick in a box and say this is where he sits on the political spectrum or on the literary spectrum or on the social spectrum. He moves around and is very fluid. And I think that's why I would emphasize, as well as liberal, he was cosmopolitan. But in being cosmopolitan, and again, this is an argument that we have to have, certainly in the United Kingdom at the moment, I'm sure, is this idea that is now floated that somehow to be cosmopolitan is to not be true to your country, if you like, right? This idea that
disconnected from the
Theresa
people.
May nonsense of if you consider yourself a citizen of what was her thing, a citizen of nowhere or whatever, right? I mean, that's not what cosmopolitanism is, right? It's being misinterpreted by people who are using nationalism for other ends, which of course was a problem on both the right and left in China in the 1930s as well. And so walking the middle line of cosmopolitanism has always been slightly tricky, and maintaining yourself as a liberal in very politically polarized times is always very tricky as well. And Lin Yutang does it, and not only does he do it, but he does it with a certain humor, which is not something that we associate with many Chinese writers. And so that makes him also a little bit different from many others. But as I say, at the moment, he's kind of been a little bit forgotten, certainly outside of Taiwan. China's not quite sure what to do with him. He hasn't had a renaissance. People don't have very strong feelings with him. I mean, anything you say about anyone at Shanghai at this time, particularly Eileen Chang, Zhang Ailing, or I find Emily Hahn, if you want to find a Westerner that was there at that time. I mean, people really feel very close to those writers. And you look at the arguments that are going on now about the film that hardly anyone's even seen yet, An Hui's a movie adaptation of Love After Love, right? And I'm already seeing lots of arguments for why it's betraying Eileen Chang, why it's support. I mean, people really get passionate about Eileen Chang. They don't get passionate about Lin Yutang in quite the same way. So I think he's due a revival. But his revival will be part of, hopefully, our return to more liberal values rather than just all becoming isolated and balkanized.
And when I look over my episode play stats, some of the, like on the main feed, the ones that get the most hits are like the first episode, which I think that's just because it's the first episode, but also it's Lucian, Diary of a Madman. And then another one of the front runners is the one I did on Lost Caution, Aileen Chung. But then when I look on the episodes on YouTube where I've put them up, and where maybe, I don't know, there's a different sort of mass audience, seems like a overly grandiose word, but that's a huge internet zone, and the play count for my upload of the Aileen Chang episode is just miles ahead of all the other episodes. So I know that, like, online, her name is like a magnet in a way that none of the other authors I've covered are. And I don't imagine Lin Yutang is going to have the same star power. But
well, yeah. People feel so possessive of Eileen Chang, and everyone has a very strong view of her. And of course, the estate has been very clever with Eileen Chang in that it has done a lot to try and control her legacy and what people know and don't know about her, and has also has all these untranslated books, right, which it's sort of slowly releasing or allowing to be filmed or allowed to be published or so on. And that's kind of very clever. So there's always new stuff coming, whereas with most of these writers we don't have any new stuff coming, right? With Eileen Chang, we know that a couple of years down the line there could be a new novel that they've got in Los Angeles and haven't done yet. So that kind of makes her interesting. But people feel a sense of ownership with Eileen Chang. I wrote something which I keep meaning to write more about, because I have a lot of information about her first freelance work, which was film reviews and fashion. But it was all done for a Nazi-funded magazine.
Oh no!
And of course, and it was Klaus Meinhardt's 20th Century magazine, which you can see online. Which I'm always pointing people to because they don't believe me. And of course, at that time, which is the other thing that's often downplayed, her husband at that time was part of Wang Jingwei's puppet traitor government. And so she got in with Meinhardt, who was a German Nazi, and he was he was teaching in Hawaii, and he was sent to Shanghai, and he was given a lot of money to set up a magazine in English called 20th Century, which at the time had a pretty smart look. It was almost like a competitor, and sort of fascist competitor to Time or Life magazine, those kind of magazines, Picture Post, that kind of thing. Lots of essays in there, lots of interesting things. It's well worth people having a look at it online. All sorts of things about the, if you're interested in all these anthropology of Tibetans and Mongolians and trying to link them in with Aryans and things.
Oh, no.
Lots of stuff attacking the British and the Americans, of course. And in there is Eileen Chang on fashions in Shanghai. I mean, no great Nazi content, lots of lovely illustrations with it. And she's talking about where skirt lengths are this year, and but it's all in occupied Shanghai, Japanese occupied Shanghai. And then there's some film reviews, which are a little more tricky. And I just happened to mention these a few times. And the idea that Eileen Chang worked with the Nazis does get a little bit of a response out there, I must admit. Some people are not very happy about that. That's not how they saw Eileen Chang. But that's how she got her start. So I feel people are very proprietorial about these sort of writers. Emily Hahn is the same from a sort of Western perspective. Actually, to a lot of people, Edgar Snow is very much Edgar Snow, who didn't like Lin Yutang, disliked Lin Yutang intensely.
Oh no.
Well, I mean, count yourself privileged to be in the group of people that Edgar Snow disliked intensely. I think. A fairly awful man, in my opinion. But he kind of, and then again, that will spark people off. But I can give you all the reasons why I think he's awful on another podcast. But this is a time when people are very, very divided. And so people are and are having to make choices that you can't necessarily understand in hindsight.
Right.
And if you want to be a freelance journalist, these are the outlets you have. And Germany and German fascism feels a long way away at the time. If I wanted to defend Eileen Chang, I could argue, right? And she just wants to get a start in the business. Of course, someone like Edgar Snow, who's much revered now, of course, has by this time tied his cart to Mao's horses, and anyone who isn't fully on board is against them, right? So Lin Yutang, because of this liberal cosmopolitanism, is again seen as being outside the tent at this point as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so going back to Lin Yutang, I'll quickly tell you the story of how I was exposed to him. And I think this raises a kind of an angle of looking at his writing we've not covered yet. So this was when I was near the end of my brief stint working in like a training school, English training school style thing. And there was an older English guy working there. He probably wouldn't be too mad if I said he was a bit of a kind of lovable grouch sort of character. And he quite liked his books and his reading. And that was something me and him could talk about. I think he saw me reading The Rebel by Camus one time, and then from then on I was in his good books. So towards the end of my stay or my time working in that company, he needed to get rid of some of his books, as a foreigner relocating in Shanghai often does. And he kind of dumped a pile of them on me and said, take whatever you like. And he said, take whatever you like, but you have to take this one. He said something like, this will help you understand Chinese people. It's the perfect guide. And it was The Art of Living by Lin Yutang.
Yes,
So
yeah.
I was very interested in reading it based on the strength of his recommendation. But a statement like, this is the guide to the Chinese mind, I was kind of dubious about, sounds a bit dated, the idea that you could have an idea to any kind of national psyche. And yet that's part of what Lin Yutang was doing in that book. It's something that you probably wouldn't try and write, or no one would publish today. There's even a really funny part of the book where he tries to, it's almost like top trumps cards for the different nations of the world. He tries to rate them on different scales. And another thing that popped into my head when you were talking about some of the articles he wrote, this one that we got today, I sourced online from the China Heritage Quarterly, and there's various pieces, articles Lin was writing in Shanghai at the time. And yeah, they're often writing about Chinese culture in a way that tries to describe the thing and the people as a whole. So what I'm trying to say is you were saying things how he's sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other. And I feel like another thing we could say about him is some of the things he says are really evergreen and don't date in the way that other more maybe politically obsessive writers, things they've written have maybe dated. They're not universally applicable. So he's written some things that are very witty and amusing and have like ticked the literature box of being evergreen. And then there's other things that you kind of have to take with a pinch of salt, where he says very essentializing things about a nationality or womankind. He seems pretty fixated on what women are all about a lot of the time. Yeah, what do you think of those sort of things when they pop up in his writing?
Oh, I think obviously we have to. We have to read him within his time, and read him within his culture as well, and what he's trying to do. I think you have to understand that he's trying to deal with having been born in Fujian, outside of a big city, to having been born into to having become a Christian, to having to have come to the big city and gone to university. I mean, lots of these things affect all of us, and we have to try and work out the society we're in. He's also in a society in flux. If effectively, really, by the time this essay is written that we're talking about today, Japan has announced its intention to go to war completely with China, and particularly with Shanghai, which it has done several years before. In 1932, it started the attack. So if you go back to 1930, and think of the Japanese annexation of Manchuria, the war with Japan is already on, right? So he's in this, so that's drawing him backwards and forwards in thinking about that. He's in Shanghai with all the Hi-Pi stuff going on. There's a lot, as the academics say these days, for him to unpack about the country and the time he's living in. And it's going to also feel very different to how we think at the time. And there's not many people in China doing this at this point. And in fact, eventually, I think, he has to leave China to do this. And other people who were thinking like this are Chinese who've gone to America, I happen to be hopefully doing a project for the BBC soon on ones that came to the UK. Chiang Yi, the journalist Xiao Qian, who was the only Chinese foreign correspondent in Europe during the Second World War. Chiang Yi, the artist, several playwrights and poets that settled in London and started to work out ideas like this, trying to understand things. Sometimes you have to put a bit of distance between yourself and the culture that you're in.
Totally.
And I think that's also, again, why, this age-old sort of silly argument that foreigners in China always have. And when I say age old, I mean like 170 years old argument about, Shanghai versus Beijing. And it's a very stupid argument. But, people take a certain position, largely depending on where their university sent them to learn Chinese, rather than any sort of, reason for this. Concrete reason. And of course, I'm in the Lin Yutang camp, which loves both cities for different reasons and flows backwards and forwards. I mean, there's another essay he writes around the time called something like Peiping, because the capital had moved to Nanjing. If people don't know, Peking's name had technically changed to Peiping or Beiping, city of peace.
Right.
So it's called Peiping of the soul, and he's trying to work out, what it is he likes about Beijing and what he doesn't like about Beijing, in the way that in Him to Shanghai, he's become very cross with Shanghai at this point in his life. And again, it's not a fixed thing. He's never a kind of person who's like, well, I live in Shanghai, so therefore Shanghai's better than Beijing. Or I live in Beijing, so therefore Beijing's better than Shanghai. It's a kind of, what are the elements in both these cities? And what are the elements that I feel are important, whether it be modernism or religion, whether it be my traditions, the traditions of China, or the exciting things I'm seeing coming in through Shanghai, right? On the sort of cultural conveyor belt that a port city like Shanghai is at any point. And I think that's kind of interesting. And he's also looking, as we can come on to talk about, he's looking at Shanghai and thinking, he's annoyed in Him to Shanghai about the vulgarity of Shanghai. And this is something that I think is something that's often said about Shanghai now, and no one really looks at the historical roots of this. Why is Shanghai seen as money obsessed and vulgar and gaudy, right, compared to Beijing? Why is that? And at this point, he's very annoyed about that vulgarity. He thinks it's destructive. And so he's drawn towards what he sees, rightly or wrongly, as the sort of, reality, the sort of core truth of Beijing, as opposed to the imposed cosmopolitanism, bohemianism, modernity of Shanghai. And he's always moving between those two positions. And that's something that I think is very useful to think about.
So you mentioned the Japanese invasion of China and Shanghai, and that's reminded me something I need to kind of give just as a disclaimer. I've cheated slightly on this episode. So on everything we've done before in the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast, and I'm speaking to the listeners here mostly, has been something written in Chinese, translated into English. We're looking at the English version. This time, it's been reversed slightly. We're reading the English version of Him to Shanghai, which Lin Yutang wrote in 1930, and he self-translated it to Chinese 3 years later in 1933, and he made a few tweaks that we might talk about later. I learned this. Paul himself had told me that Lin was a self-translator, and I found a little bit of I think it's someone's master's thesis I found online. So I'll just quickly read an excerpt of that. Again, just as a disclaimer, so we're being clear about this. So it says here, the English essay was written in 1930 when international settlement, chiefly of Western countries, had been established for over 60 years, and colonialism existed for more than half a century in Shanghai. The Chinese essay was published in 1933, 1 year after Shanghai was attacked by Japan, and would soon be weathered with raids, invasions, and outright occupation by the Japanese till the mid-40s. Do I want to keep going? Have I stapled these in the wrong order? I have. Oh, geez. Yeah. The changing political environment forced Lin to change his way of critique. A direct one was replaced by a concealed one disguised under a veil of humor. But yeah, we'll come back to talk about some of the differences in the translation later. Just now, I have a question about Lin Yutang and Art Deco. Are you ready for that one?
Yes. Okay. It'll be fun. Yeah.
Right. So it's not technically just about Art Deco, because you mentioned earlier that Lin is a really big, I don't know what's the right word, a lover of modernism. He's really invested in this artistic movement, and he was involved, like you said, with some of the other writers who were resident and writing in Shanghai at the time. But what's all that got to do with Art Deco in Shanghai? And what's Art Deco got to do with Shanghai, we should probably say as well?
Well, I think when people come to Shanghai, one of the things that often foreigners like, and the Chinese themselves like, as you can see from a million kind of Art Deco themed Old Shanghai cafes that pop up and close down with incredible rapidity, is that it is something that people like a lot and they feel very drawn to. This is true sort of around the world of Art Deco. An art form, that really inflected so many things between the wars. One of the things that probably, I'm always asked about Art Deco because I write about China at this period. And to me, Art Deco is a very interesting way of looking at Shanghai. Normally, they just say, look, here's all the Art Deco. Doesn't this show that this is an international city? They were building Art Deco. Foreign architects, then some Chinese architects decided to sort of do their version of Art Deco. And isn't that interesting? And now whenever we build anything, like when the Kadoris came back and built the new Peninsula Hotel on the Bund, down near the old British consulate, they decided to do it in an Art Deco style, mostly an American Art Deco style, which you wouldn't really find elsewhere much in Shanghai. So there's all sorts of problems around there. What Lin Yutang found around Art Deco and what a lot of people found around this time is that to many people, Art Deco, now, of course, it's looked back on nostalgically and people find it interesting. They like finding it in junk shops and they like building it. And of course, it has its fans. There are Art Deco societies, there are Art Deco fans, conferences on. But essentially what they don't like to talk about is the fact that many, many people at the time, and still today, in my case, for instance, find Art Deco to be vulgar. It is a vulgar art form for many, many reasons. It's urban, vernacular culture. It's reasonably shallow, I would argue, and I think many art critics would argue it requires no real great depth of aesthetic experience to enjoy it. It's of the mass, it's factory produced, it's also about verticality. So if you want to know where Pudong begins, it begins, of course, as a response to the Art Deco verticality of Puxi, right, with the idea of go higher, higher, higher. This is one of the things that Lin Yutang found vulgar about Shanghai. And of course, thinking at the time, the mid-1930s, of the absolute opposite of verticality being Beijing at that time, a city then largely of hutongs and low-level buildings, no high buildings really at all at that time. So Lin is repulsed by the vulgarity that is most obvious in Art Deco, this sort of shallow version of modernism. And he refers to it. He talks about, in an introduction he wrote to this essay, he talks about, where is it? He says it. He talks about the vulgarities, the strange mixture. Shanghai is terrible in her strange mixture of Eastern and Western vulgarity, in her superficial refinement, in her naked and unmasked worship of mammon, or money, in her emptiness, and in her bad taste. Now, this is not how many people who are very loving of Old Shanghai like to think of it. Right? This is not what they want to think about when they think about it.
I can hear some fans booing right now.
He then goes on to refer to the stupid and vulgar faces that appeared at the Majestic, a nightclub at that time, and again he uses vulgar, and in the but this is in the introduction, and he doesn't. When he translated it, as we say, into Chinese, he didn't translate that introduction. So we don't know what word he would have used for vulgar as he translated it. I mean, the word I would use, would be just yongsu, right? Just vulgar in that way. But there are other words he could have used, more vernacular words and more dismissive words to describe Art Deco. So it's interesting that Shanghai, as I've said before, it is a colonial city that also became a refuge, but it is also a city of modernism, very genuine modernism in many ways. particularly if we look at the work people like Lim Pan, who introduced me to Lin Yutang, by the way, who's a great writer and a great lady of Shanghai. Has done on typography and magazine design and things like this. Some of the writing that we see at that time, that I worked with Andrew Field, who's now at Duke University in Kunshan, on translating, or he did the translations. Mu Sheying, who is again a much overlooked now, purposefully overlooked, because like Eileen Chang's husband, he went with Wang Jingwei and was assassinated for that, who wrote many high modernist short stories in a great modernist tradition. So it's a city of real modernism, but it's also a city of vulgar, mass-produced modernism, which I would describe as Art Deco. Someone in a European context called Art Deco modernism for the uneducated, right? When we look at Shanghai, I think it's really important not to sort of look at it and go, wow, look at the Art Deco. And of course, I don't advocate knocking down any of that Art Deco. I'd like to save it all. But I think when I look at it, I see something slightly different to the great fans of Art Deco. I see that as really the apex between the wars of the vulgarity, and as Lin Yutang would have said, the bad taste, the emptiness, the unmasked worship of mammon, the superficial refinement. So this is the alternative analysis of Hi-Pi, which is that it is a strange mixture of Eastern and Western vulgarity, and I think that that is quite a takedown on Shanghai, and it's at a time when Lin Yutang is transitioning, if you like, in his thinking towards favoring Beijing over Shanghai. But it's very important, and I think it does express something that, of course, in 1949, when the great dust sheet was thrown over the city, nothing happened for a long time. And then we get going again in kind of the late 90s. And people forget that Shanghai was really one of the last big city to be allowed to reform and open up. Deng Xiaoping knew that Shanghai had to be last, because otherwise it would swallow up too much else from the other coastal cities. So he made it last. And then when it did get going, it went straight back and did gaudiness and vulgarity, right, with the Oriental Pearl Tower. Now, if that has any fans, they'll be arguing. But I remember watching that going up, and then when they tapped it off, we just went, so is that meant to be retro? Is it meant to look like something from the 1950s in California, right? But it wasn't. It was supposed to be modern in the future. And we were just like, wow, there is a vulgar modernity that has happened again. And we've seen it again and again and again with skyscrapers and buildings in Shanghai, self-glorification, self-aggrandizement. And this is a long-running and deep tradition in Shanghai that is the other side of Hi-Pi. When you don't want to talk about, great novels by Lucian and Barjin and things, you've got to talk about some of this self-aggrandizing architecture.
Previously on the show, I jokingly crossed swords with Eric Abrahamson over what's better, Southern China or Northern China. I'm going to have to do the same here. I really like Art Deco, not for deep reasons. Maybe that's where we differ. I don't mind enjoying a superficial thing. But it's funny, it's reminding me of something that happened just a couple of days ago. My dad came to visit me and my girlfriend, and he brought us some gin. And we were talking about, not that I have much to say about gins, it's kind of the point, but he said something like, oh, it's not like these stupid gin liqueurs, these ones that aren't really even real gin. And I took one out from our shelf. It was like a Edinburgh gin, rhubarb and something gin liqueur. I'm like, yeah, you mean like this? It's really nice. And he's like, yes, I suppose it's really just an alcohol pop though, isn't it? And then I thought, right, okay, I'm going to have to change the topic of conversation here. I was just enjoying my nice gin liqueur.
Look, Angus, you're allowed to like what you like, right? But you also have to accept that some people are going to see it as symbolism
Trash.
Of the nouveau riche, of a lack of sophistication. And that may also be certainly a sense of snobbery. And of course, you may or may not think snobbery is a bad thing. I mean, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. So, there will be people that have different feelings about it. The point is, if you like the ephemeral, if you like the mass produced, if you like this style, that's fine. But you have to understand what the context of it is, whether it's in Palm Beach, Florida, whether it's in parts of London or Brussels, or whether it's in Shanghai. You have to understand why it occurred and what it represents at a moment in an economic and political cycle that it comes to the forefront.
That's fair. I suppose I'm a hypocrite. There's plenty of things I'm a bit of a snob about, so I would concede your point there for sure.
Yeah.
Before we
I'm with you,
really
Dad, on the gin, by the way.
well, then we'll never agree on that, I'm afraid. Right. So now that we're getting a bit silly, let's talk about humor. So I've read in a few places now, Lin Yutang brought a new word into Chinese, a transliteration of humor, mo. So what do you think he was doing here, or was he trying to achieve bringing mo, this kind of, no one's going to say there was no comedy in Chinese culture, but he was trying to bring in this Western particular version of something that can make you laugh or smile, humor, mo. So what was he doing with it? And do you see any humor or mo in him to Shanghai?
Well, I think I'm not an expert on this, and there are several very good books on it. One by an academic at Hong Kong University whose name has escaped me, that came out recently, or a couple of years ago. I think that to me, it's rather like the move among many of those Shanghai writers and others towards the vernacular, towards speaking in terms of the way that ordinary people spoke, to creating the modern novel in a modern language. And I think that his use of humor is often like that, and as part of the takedown. Hymn to Shanghai was written as a riposte, as a reply to a rather pompous academic who had done a very, very, which I'm not going to go into because I'm not Christian and I'm certainly no theologian, a very long sort of analogy of Shanghai with Alexandria. And fight people dying outside the gates of heaven. It's very complicated. Lin Yutang, as a Christian and someone who had been exposed to missionaries and so on, got this and saw the pomposity of it. I would be, and he makes fun of it, saying that I must be right in thinking that Alexandria was situated somewhere in Egypt on the mouth of the Nile, as Shanghai is now situated on the dirty Huangpu. So there is some use to middle school teaching of geography after all. And that's basically the only good thing he says about that essay. And so when he goes into, as we'll hear, the hymn of Shanghai, he immediately starts saying, "Oh, great and inscrutable city, thy city of hugging flesh, thrice praise to the city, great and inscrutable art thou." One thinketh of thy successful pian-pian-bellied merchants, one thinketh of thy naked dancers, and he does it in this kind of biblical language, right? Which would be the thundering missionary from the pulpit, who cannot be questioned, or the Bible, which you are just supposed to accept and not really question. And he uses that to great mock effect, quite an analysis of quite how he managed to translate that is way beyond me. But it is that in itself is funny if you know the context to what he's responding to. He is mocking the language of the cleric, of the missionary. And we know at the time, of course, that many of the missionaries in China, both Chinese that had converted and the Western missionaries that went there, were very thunder and brimstone type missionaries. They often did speak like this, and many people who were educated or learnt their English from missionaries sometimes learnt a very antiquated form of English that was almost like this. The only thing I said once, I must say, and this was years ago, I wrote a biography of an American that lived in Shanghai who started one of the first advertising agencies in China called Carl Crow. And he wrote a great book called 400 Million Customers. Really, really great person to read about the foreign experience in China. A kind of, a great, if you read Lin Yutang, Carl Crow is someone who's worth reading as well. Anyway, I got asked to go and talk about it at one of these where you speak English to a Chinese audience so they can hear native speakers by the American consulate in Chengdu, which is no longer. And I went up there, and it was all a bit weird because they thought I was American. So the idea was that you expose Chinese people to American accents so that it feels like America's winning because more Chinese would speak English with an American accent. And of course, I
have to be honest, you don't sound American.
No, I turn up with my dulcet, North London tones, and And anyway, we did this. And at the end of it, an old man who was very caricature of, Lao Baixing came up, Chinese slippers, I mean, pretty shabby clothing. He obviously wasn't a man of any great financial wealth or anything, but and I would have guessed maybe in his 80s. He came up to me and he spoke the most amazing but completely outdated English in an English accent far superior to mine. Like he could have read the news on the BBC in 1937. Right. I mean, like not now when it's all regional accents. He could have read the news back then when there was only one sort of accent. And his family had been Christian, and he had gone to a missionary school and learnt English this way and managed to maintain his English all through the vicissitudes and ups and downs of post-war China. And there he was. I mean, I imagine he's no longer with us, but there he was in the 1990s in Chengdu, an old man, still had this English and going along every week to the American embassy just for the excuse to hear and occasionally to speak a little bit of English. And the rest of the room was sort of, young people who were planning to go to university in the West. And this old man that just sat at the back with the most perfect English. So there were people who spoke like this. And one of the reasons I know normally you look at translation from Chinese into English or whatever, it's interesting to look at it the other way, because it tells you something about that generation of intellectuals around Lin Yutang. And so many of the people who were senior political, social, cultural, creative leaders of nationalist China had either a missionary education or had gone and studied in America, or to a lesser extent, the United Kingdom or France. And really were able to really were bilingual and able to communicate. So this essay, this short piece, this poem, whatever we want to call it, was written for the China Critic, which was completely produced by Chinese intellectuals in English. And Lin Yutang had a column in it called The Little Critic, of which this was once a column. But these people were so well educated that they could translate themselves. They could go backwards and forwards. And we sort of forget that in those old days, you can read press conferences that many different Chinese government figures had with Western journalists. And they chatted. And at the end of it, they'd sing, the old songs of Harvard University or Yale or Columbia or Oxford and Cambridge, I mean, they had all studied in places like this. Whereas, of course, since then, we've become used to generations of politicians in China who have been, if they were educated abroad, it was probably Russia, right? So a very different, tradition. And so it's worth remembering that there was this much more, if you like, sophisticated cosmopolitan element to the Chinese ruling class at that time.
Mm-hmm. I've thought about this once or twice, and I know I've seen people talking about this in regards to Putin, but I was thinking like world leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping especially, but other ones too. The thought in my head, and I'm sure in other people's heads too, is do these people have really good English? Because it would make an awful lot of sense if they did, but even if they did, would they ever let on publicly? Would they ever speak English into a microphone? It would, I guess today it would seem like a loss of face for someone if Xi Jinping spoke in his English to an international conference rather than going through a translator. It's, at least in my mind, it's pretty unthinkable. I can't picture it at all.
It's fairly brave leaders that do it. I seem to remember Tony Blair once attempting a speech in French that was rather lampooned by the French. But then, you're fairly daring to order a cup of coffee in France, aren't you, really, without being lampooned? So it's, I think it's, and also everyone's so worried about saying the wrong thing and getting it very wrong. That it probably wouldn't happen then. But then there was much more kind of, off the record briefings. People often knew each other. I mean, many of these, many leaders, say, for instance, in nationalist China had studied at one university in America that took very many Chinese students on different courses, was the University of Missouri. And many of them were all alumni. So they'd known each other. And of course, Chiang Kai-shek, not necessarily Chiang Kai-shek himself, but Chiang Kai-shek's wife, of course, Mei Ling-sung and the Sung family. I mean, all very bilingual. It was just a different time in terms of the bilingual nature of leaders, I think, and cultural leaders as well.
As you were talking there about the kind of biblical stuff and also the sense of humor, a couple of things popped into my head. One was the film Metropolis by Fritz Lang. Have you seen that one?
Yes, and it's funny you should ask me that, because someone who's writing a PhD at the moment on something or other, contacted me recently to say, did I have any evidence that Metropolis was ever shown at a cinema in Shanghai? And I managed to find an advert. I spend a lot of time looking at old newspapers, old Shanghai newspapers, English language and French and Chinese, and found that it had been on at a cinema in the International Concession and was actually reviewed as well. So yes, again, German expressionism. I mean, this is another thing that feeds into the whole hype. I mean, port cities, this thing about Shanghai, it's a port city. So of course it's always going to have greater exposure to foreigners and foreign ideas, right? I mean, port cities, whether it be Marseille, Liverpool, New York, wherever, are always going to be more multicultural and often, if it's allowed, more multinational, and have people from different backgrounds. And that is where ideas are going to come in. And ideas are going to go out from as well. It's going to be where everyone goes at some point. So many people go to Shanghai because they're coming in on ocean liners, on round the world cruises or cruises to elsewhere. So many people, Chinese people, go to Shanghai because they are leaving to go and study abroad or live abroad or work abroad or something. So these are great. Shanghai is a great transmission belt of ideas. But of course, as the North Koreans used to say about economic reform, it's all very well opening a window, but the flies get in. And so there's always going to. It's also why port cities are also, great sources of crime and sin and fun as well, I think.
Yeah, the reason I was thinking about Metropolis was because, at least in my memory of the film, because it's been years since I watched it, so we have a depiction of a city that's very modern in like the capital M sense, but it's also like very kind of there's a lot of partying going on, morally questionable partying, debauchery you might call it, and the film itself, but also its hero, denouncing the kind of hedonistic lifestyle. And just from my memory of it, I remember it seeming like a very sort of Christian, like, I don't know what's the word, like a missionary spreading. I'm sure there's a scene where the protagonist spreads his arms in the air in horror, witnessing what we could just say is other people having fun.
The missionaries used to say that Shanghai was a thick slice of hell on a thin slice of heaven. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen the film for a long time, but I mean that idea, but also of that being something to do with modernity, right? So if we look at, particularly look at literary journal covers and magazine covers of that time, the artists, there's a big influence of German expressionism, and we see a lot of pictures of dance halls, people with monocles in there, almost always inspired often by German expressionist pictures, paintings and drawings. And I think, that notion of the new, the modern, whether it be automobiles. I mean, we'll come on later perhaps to talk about books about Shanghai, but if you read Andre Malraux's Man's Fate, which I think is a great book about Shanghai, in the very first few pages, what does he have? He has, and it's 1927, he has, set in 1927, he has traffic jams, car hooters, phonograph records being played, electric lights, just noise, right? Noise, light, neon, which Shanghai was known for, the lighting up of the nighttime space, restaurants that are open all night. I've written in City of Devils about the introduction of slot machines, and we'll talk here perhaps about greyhound racing, which is much more, I don't want to criticize anyone who's written about it later, much more interesting than the bloody horse racing, right? Horse racing was for the elites, and it was old school. Where everyone could get together was the greyhound racing, and that's true in every country actually, as opposed to horse racing. And really, it's also a form of modernity. It's done under floodlights with the electric rabbit racing round in front of it, and totalizer betting as well, which requires a certain level of technology to organize. So all of this, I think, is being reflected in the art and the work that's coming out of it. And as you say, the same thing is happening in Weimar, Germany, as it is to an extent in London and Paris, the city of light, and London, where Piccadilly, where everything is going on, and New York, of course. So all of these, and the city Shanghai is often compared to by some as Chicago. So all of that is going on at that time, and is again influencing Lin Yutang. And in this particularly, he's not so sure it's a good idea.
Right.
But there's other times when he thinks it's a brilliant idea, right? So he's going back, like we all do. He's going backwards and forwards. Do I love the internet? Do I hate the internet? Do I love social media? Do I hate social media?
Mhm. Well, speaking of being in a sort of middle position, when it comes to greyhound racing and horse racing, I'm pleased to be a very detached Lin Yutang. We don't have to disagree over that like we do about gin and Art Deco. Another thing I was going to ask you about just before we get on to him to Shanghai itself, or maybe not even ask you about, just comment on. It's another one of those little articles that is up on the China Heritage Quarterly website, which I think is an amazing example of how Lin Yutang would try and get a laugh whilst also talking about issues of the times. Is a little piece called "Do Bed Bugs Exist in China?" Have you read that one?
No, I don't think I have. I think I read his one about why there's no seagulls on the Huangpu.
This one, I'll try and summarize it. You can read, listeners and anyone, I'll link to it in the show notes. You can read this one in a few minutes. So basically, he starts with describing a scene where a group of people, could be anywhere in the world, but just for our purposes, it's China. He says, a bed bug crawls out from a sofa, and one of the hosts, not wishing to let anyone see it, sits on it, and he kind of uses the bed bug as a metaphor for like any embarrassing flaw in a country. So the article titled "Do Bed Bugs Exist in China?" is basically "Do problems exist in China?" And then he has, I think it's like a modern listicle article. It's like 8 different people's responses to the question. So there's like the KMT government who say anyone who talks about bedbugs existing in China is not patriotic and should be sent to jail. And then there's I think it's the North Shanghai, there's one of the foreign-run newspapers. Their response is...
North China Daily News.
Something like that, yeah. Their response is, bedbugs exist in China, but we don't have them in England. We demand extraterritoriality. And the second to last one, it's Dr. Hu She, who, if I understand rightly, was one of Lin Yutang's kind of a like-minded fellow intellectual. And Hu She gives like the sensible liberal cosmopolitan position, which is like, well, if bed bugs exist in any country, be it China, Japan, Germany, or England, we should sort them out and find out if there are more. And that's your kind of boring, straight answer at the end. And then the last one, it's Lin Yutang himself, and he says, "Oh, a bed bug, excellent! I'll use this to make my point and get a laugh or two." And then the final line is one of Lin Yutang's guests saying, "Lin Yutang, you disgusting man! What are you talking about?" And that's the end of it. And I think if you want like a good, maybe not an intro to his writing because it's in a listicle, not essay format, but his sense of humor and his way of looking at things is really embedded in that little "Do Bed Bugs Exist" joke article, I think. But yeah, let's go on to the him to Shanghai itself. Now, in the list of questions I sent you, it says, "Let's hop on our spaceship and look at the novel itself." That's an accident. That's because I adapted this for the questions I'm going to do about Cat Country, which really is a story about going to another planet. But just ignore the spaceship part and let's look at him to Shanghai. I was wondering, would you like to read this with me, line by line, taking it turnabout?
Yeah, there's definitely some. I mean, I think people will get it's not very long, and I think people will get the idea of it. But it might be nice to do some of the examples he uses have maybe been a bit lost to history, I think.
Right, so we can kind of give our spark notes as we go through. Here we go. Okay. Take a breath. Shanghai is terrible, very terrible. Shanghai is terrible in her strange mixture of Eastern and Western vulgarity, in her superficial refinements, and in her naked and unmasked worship of Mammon, in her emptiness, commonness, and bad taste. She is terrible in her denaturalized women, denaturalized coolies, devitalized newspapers, decapitalized banks, and denationalized creatures. She is terrible in her greatness as well as her weakness, terrible in her perversities and inanities, terrible in her joys and follies, and in her tears, bitterness, and degradation, terrible in her vast immutable stone edifices that rear their head high on the bund, and in the abject huts of creatures subsisting on their discoveries from refuse cans. In fact, one might sing a hymn to the great, terrible city in the following fashion.
O great and inscrutable city, thrice praise to thy greatness and to thy inscrutability.
Thrice praise to the city renowned for her copper odor and her fat, oily bankers with green-tinted skins and sticky fingers.
To thy city of hugging flesh and dancing flesh, of flat-chested ladies fed on ginseng soup and dove's nest congee, and still looking anemic and weary of life in spite of their ginseng soup and dove's nest congee.
I wonder, do you know what ginseng soup is? I'm not familiar with that one.
Yes, it's simply ginseng.
Ah, right. Okay. So obvious. I didn't see it. Let's keep going. To the city of eating flesh and sleeping flesh, of ladies with bamboo shoot feet and willow waists, rouged faces and yellow teeth, cackling ha 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 like monkeys from their cradles to their graves.
To the city of running flesh and kowtowing flesh, of hotel boys with shining slippery heads and slipperier manners, who minister to the fat, oily bankers with green-tinted skins and sticky fingers, and to hugging flesh and dancing flesh with rouged cheeks and yellow teeth.
Great and inscrutable art thou.
In the still hours of the night, one conjureth up a picture on thy monstrosities. In the muddy stream of human traffic on Nanking Road, muddier than the muddy fish of the muddy Huangpu, one thinketh of thy greatness also.
One thinketh of thy successful pian-pian-bellied merchants, and forgetteth whether they are Italian, French, Russian, English, or Chinese. And we should stop here and say, for people who don't know, what's pian-pian?
Pian-pian to me is the kind of the way that people with a large belly sort of walk with it, rather protruding and proud as they walk along with it.
It seems like it's kind of onomatopoeic, kind of sounds like what it means. Anyway, yeah. Let's keep going. One thinketh of thy masseuses, naked dancer, Carlo Garcias, and thy Fuzhou Road sing-song houses. So let's pause here. Is Fuzhou Road particularly notorious at this time?
Well, yes. Fuzhou Road, which is now, of course, mostly a street of bookshops, and was then as well as restaurants. But the little alleyways off of the Lilang, off of Fuzhou Road, were very well known for being houses of prostitution, brothels. And so people went there. Now, the reference to Carlos Garcia is a very interesting one, because if you've read my book, City of Devils, you'll know that Carlos Garcia is mentioned in there. Now, Carlos Garcia was a Mexican who came to Shanghai and in the 1920s made an awful lot of money running tequila from his own family all the way from Mexico to Shanghai. And in Shanghai, he put it in barrels marked pig's bristles. A major export between Shanghai and America in the 1920s was pig's bristles, which made toothbrushes. They were the sort of...
Oh, no.
Those were toothbrushes, yeah. And not something a customs man would want to look too closely at until they were properly cleaned and used. And he would fill that with tequila and ship it from Shanghai to the west coast of America. So a massive round trip, but because of the profits in prohibition, he made an awful lot of money. Money he invested in two things. Well, money he invested in a casino called The Wheel, which was, I forget what road it was on, but it was very successful until the police busted it, largely because other casino operators were angry about it. And he ended up doing a year in Ward Road Jail, which is the old jail in Tilan Chao, which shut a few years ago. Right. He came out determined to get his revenge on various British interests that he felt had informed on him to the police. He looked at what they were doing, which was running dog racing tracks, one called Luna Park and another one out in Yangpu. And he decided to build what became the Canidrome in Frenchtown, which was an enormous and the most modern building, an enormous nightclub, which, if you'll know from City of Devils, is where Joe Farron, one of the stars of that, a choreographer and dancer, brought Buck Clayton and his Harlem Gentlemen, one of the first big American jazz bands to come to Shanghai. And next to it was the stadium, which was there until the early 2000s on Maoming. Those who remember when Maoming Road was a little bar strip at the sort of Frenchtown end of Maoming Road, will remember that if you drank there late enough, you could wander into the flower market in the morning. And the flower market was in the old stands of the Canidrome. It's all gone now. It's a sort of a musical venue and a big sort of soulless landscaped park. Look at pictures online, absolutely incredible, very modern, Art Deco. And of course, it ran greyhound racing, but also was a big centre for other, I would argue, more than horse racing, more proletarian, all-encompassing, i.e. Chinese foreigners, anyone could go, boxing, football, by which I mean soccer, and mostly dog racing, which took place in the evenings. And just across the road was the Hayalai fronton for obviously the Basque sport of Hayalai, which was big at the time. And all of that was run by Carlos Garcia. So that's why he gets a particular mention.
So all that in just 2 words, making up a name. Amazing. Do you want to keep us going with the next verse?
Of thy retired Tao Tai and Tufai, and magistrates and generals with tortoise-shell spectacles and roof-shaped moustaches, trying to court sing-song girls with their lute, and find their love repulsed and their sexual hunger unappeased after months of courtship.
So help me out here. What's a Tao Tai and what's a Tu Fei?
A Tao Tai is essentially a Dao Tai, or a local governor, a politician, invariably considered by Lin Yutang to be corrupt. And often when they finished being the governor of an area of Jiangsu and robbing it of as much tax money as they could, they retired and bought nice houses in Shanghai. A Tu Fei is another word for a bandit or sort of minor warlord robber. And of course, what he's doing is linking the idea of a corrupt politician and an outright bandit. Right. So he's linking the two together, and magistrates and generals. So all of these people are corrupt. He does mention tortoise-shell spectacles. You can't watch a film or a TV series about Old Shanghai without seeing lots of tortoise-shell spectacles. Right. And roof-shaped moustaches, by which he means this kind of Chinese-eaved roof, which you'll see as well. Sing-song girls are not technically prostitutes, of course. They're more sort of courtesans, entertainment girls. Although everyone was always trying to get them to move from being a sing-song girl to being a prostitute or their mistress, courtesan, concubine, whatever you want to say. And so there's always lots of jokes in Chinese literature at the time. I'm sure he talks about books where it's mentioned and short stories about people pursuing sing-song girls, spending vast amounts of money, which goes not really to the girl, but to the sing-song house, many of which were on Fuchao or Fuchao Road, and never kind of, never getting to the ultimate prize, or as we might say, being too common English, British chaps, not getting their leg over. So that again is quite humorous and a sort of a funny take on a certain type of thing in Shanghai that was a running gag. The sort of provincial merchant that goes to a sing-song house, falls in love with a lovely girl, but spends lots and lots of money, but is never quite able to consummate the relationship.
Right. Okay, I'm going to keep us going. Of the idiotic and half-witted sons of these retired Tao Tai and generals, who helped to rid them of their ill-begotten gains and sin-smelling wealth. Well,
I should mention there, of course, that the idea that the sons and daughters of the rich and powerful, are fairly useless and just go racing around the streets in Ferraris and everything has its historic counterpart.
Right. That's what's the word we use these days? Fuar Dai.
Fuar Dai, yeah. Of thy wealthy, degenerate opium smokers who parade the streets in Packard 8s, guarded by robust, well-fed, uniformed Russians. Now, that refers to, of course, the practice of opium smoking, which is still going on. Packard 8s are American cars, big American cars that were much favored by wealthy merchants. And many of the Russian emigres, former Tsarist military officers, were hired on as bodyguards by many Chinese businessmen and politicians. Why? Well, two reasons, really. One, it was a sort of show-off thing. Look at me with my big white guys that protect me. And two, because it was felt that their allegiance would be to whoever paid them rather than to maybe someone else who came from the district they came from or their clan or something, who might be able to persuade them to turn around and assassinate their employer.
Yeah, I was really curious about the Russians, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense now that you've explained it. Anyway, let me keep things going. Of thy Wangpu daily receiving its quota of would-be suicides, of thy dancing girls and heartbroken young men mingling with the muddy Huangpu fish.
Oh, well, I would like to mention here that in the last issue of the Shanghai Literary Review, I wrote a piece called Shanghai's Suicide Hotels, which is really about just a very high rate of suicide in Shanghai. Shanghai was a uber capitalist society. There was no safety net, no unemployment benefit, no national health service, nothing like that. If you failed financially or in terms of your health or old age, there really was no one to stop you. And so suicide among both Chinese and foreigners was extremely common. And very interestingly, one of the major ways that the foreigners used to shoot themselves invariably or jump out of windows. Chinese didn't like either of those things, but they did have a tendency to jump into the Huangpu. The papers are just full of people jumping into the Huangpu. And this was largely attributed to the fact that at that time, it was felt that many Chinese couldn't swim. So it was a bit of a quicker death than if you suddenly changed your mind and started struggling and swimming. But Shanghai was always, and this is part of Shanghai, that, if you failed, you really failed. And often for many people, suicide was the only way they saw of ending that situation.
Oh, that's sad. So let's keep going. Oh, sorry, it's your turn, isn't it?
Yes. of thy majestic tables, where vulgarity gathers to meet vulgarity, and see how vulgarity dresses. Well, this goes back to the notion of vulgarity that I was talking about before, which I think is really important in Lin Yutang's analysis of Shanghai. The majestic was, at the time when he wrote this, at the late 1920s, the best hotel in Shanghai. This is before Sir Victor Sassoon built the Cathay Hotel. It was owned by the Kadoorie family, who owned the Peninsula Hotel Group, another Baghdadi Jewish family who had become very wealthy in Shanghai. And it had regular tea dances where Chinese and foreigners could go to. Actually, by the time that the Majestic was knocked down in around late 1929, 1930. So when this version came out in Chinese, that hotel had already gone, but everyone would have remembered it. It was such a landmark.
Right. That's why it's majestic with a big M. It's me next, isn't it?
Yes.
Of thy dog races, where white women in V-shaped evening dresses mingle merrily and run shoulders with yellow shop apprentices and grey dogs and pink-eyed rabbits. Is there anything to say here?
Oh, I think this is really important. I just recently read James Carter, the sinologist from America, did a book on the Shanghai Race Club, and it's a really, really interesting book. But in my view, it rather downplays the importance of greyhound racing because, as I said, it was much more egalitarian, much more proletarian. Everybody went to the dog races. Not everybody could go to the horse races, and it didn't appeal to everybody. Also, the horse races were often during the day when many of us had to go to work. Dog racing was often in the evenings. There were daytime dog racing. It was often in the evenings under floodlights. So that's why we have, white women in their evening dresses who are probably going to the Canidrome ballroom, Carlos Garcia's Canidrome dog racing truck. And they are there with yellow shop apprentices, by which he means, of course, Chinese people. It would be a very egalitarian crowd. If you've ever been to Happy Valley in Hong Kong, you'll know it's a very egalitarian crowd that go to those horse races, which are more akin to the old Shanghai dog races. Grey dogs and, of course, the pink-eyed rabbits that run ahead for the dogs to chase. So it's very important to bring dog racing back as this great egalitarian leveler in Shanghai. That's really where all Shanghai gathered, not the jockey club, but at the actual dog racing track.
Right. You're next.
Of thy nouveau riche, lost and giddy in the whirlpool of parties and rides, millionaires who order hotel boys about like lieutenant colonels and eat their soup with their knives.
What's up with the eating their soup with their knives line? What's that about?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. I just think that he's maybe talking there about these generals and soldiers that he said sort of, make lots of money, the corrupt money, and then come and live in Shanghai, just sort of ending up in Western style restaurants and not quite sure how to do it. He's rather mocking them, I think, for their kind of vulgarity.
Right. So the nouveau riche he's talking about here are the Chinese nouveau riche, maybe.
Yes, I think he's talking about the Chinese nouveau riche. And this is, again, why, you have to understand that Lin Yutang is a snob as well as anything. Now, whether you think, again, as I said earlier, if you think a snob is a bad thing, then you're probably not going to like Lin Yutang. If you think that, it's kind of funny, to mock these people, then you won't have so much of a problem with it. But that's certainly what he's doing. And he's looking at, I think if you'd asked Lin Yutang, he would have probably looked at the idea of, well, the vulgarity comes from the vulgar way they made their money by stealing it.
Right. Yeah, I think even if you don't like snobs, Lin Yutang might have enough charm in his writing to win you over. But let's keep going with the story here, or the piece. Of thy nouveau moderns, intoxicated by a few phrases of Yang Qingpan pidgin, and never letting an opportunity slip for saying many thanks and excuse me to you. So what exactly is going on here in this section?
Oh, well, he's talking here about the modern ones, those Chinese that have embraced or Western culture and like to throw in English phrases, English mannerisms into their language. And this is also the sort of people who start to attend the tea balls at the Majestic, for instance, and later on dancing to the jazz bands and wearing Western suits and Western clothes and so on. He's really talking about those. Yang Qingpang or Yang Jingbang pidgin is slightly lost on us now because the Yang Jingbang Creek, which used to run, if you know Shanghai, you'll know around where the Great World Amusement Center is, just along from there. Obviously, that's Xizanglu, where the YMCA is. Through the middle there, sort of running parallel to the Yan'an Expressway from the Bund, used to be the Yangjingbang Creek, which wasn't as big as Suzhou Creek, but was a major waterway. And there was a whole community that lived around it that I do believe had its own, I'm not going to say dialect exactly, but more sort of argot that it spoke. And in fact, everyone knows, of course, the Green Gang and the Red Gang, the two great criminal gangs of Shanghai, Du Yuesheng's Green Gang and Huang Jingrong's, pockmarked Huang's Red Gang, big-eared Du's Green Gang. There was originally a third gang called the Blue Gang that was centered around the Yangjingbang. But the Yangjingbang Creek was sort of covered over around the time of the First World War. So again, he's referring back to something, it's almost, he's referring back to almost, I don't know, I imagine if you were, in an English context, if you were to sort of refer back to the sort of the slanginess of the sort of Cray Twins era London or something like that. Do you know what I mean? It's something everyone knows, but it's kind of disappeared under the modernity of Shanghai.
That's interesting that even at the time he's writing, this thing's already literally been concreted over, but it's still existent as a entry in the local vernacular or vocabulary. It's really interesting. I think it's your turn to do the next verse.
Of thy girl students perched astride their baggage on the rickshaws with rolled socks and hats on which perch robin redbreasts and chrysanthemums of different colours.
Okay, so listeners won't see this, but robin redbreasts is capitalized. Is there something I'm missing here?
I don't know. Maybe I'm missing it too. I'm just assuming that he's talking about when people were moving around or come to college, they throw all their baggage onto the chair of the rickshaw and then sit on top of it. And this is the kind of clothing they're wearing, but with adornments, a brooch of a robin redbreast or a chrysanthemum. I'm assuming that's what he's talking about. And again, the modernity of having adornment on your clothing, rolled socks and hats, all of this is the sort of modernity of school uniform, of the Western style school uniform, and of jewelry and fashion.
Right. Okay, my turn. Of thy haughty, ungentlemanly foreigners, so haughty and ungentlemanly that one knows where they belong in their own countries, men with a moderate head, but stiff boots and strong calf muscles.
Men who give large-sized tips and complain of exorbitant prices, who feel legitimately aggrieved and insulted when people fail to understand their native land.
Okay, let's pause here. These last two verses. So the foreigner who gets mad when no one speaks English, that's definitely a genre of Lawai that's I've met a few times in Shanghai, let's say. But the verse that comes before that about like specifying their boots and their calf muscles and the fact they're haughty, I'm not so sure if that's still a kind of foreigner you can meet in China. Do you know what's going on there?
I think he's referring, as did other Chinese at the time, to somewhat of the sort of, it almost goes back to the original descriptions of the foreigners that you read around the time of the Canton trade and much earlier. And I think it's just more the sort of size and the stridency and the way they hold themselves and they sort of, move around what I guess we'd now call sort of white privilege, just sort of walking in and out of rooms, answering to no one, feeling, not needing any encouragement, never feeling they might be doing the wrong thing, and I think a lot of us who don't come perhaps from a higher social standing, when we first go to restaurants, we never quite know what knife and fork to use. We never quite know how to pour tea, or I hate it when anyone gives me a wine list, that kind of thing, right? And I think there are other people, and obviously many white people of all backgrounds, but even today you'll get certain people who just have the ability to do that, the sort of Boris Johnson ability to just walk up and just fluff it totally and think they've pulled it off and no one can tell them any different. So I have met that kind of foreigner as well, but I've met them in my own country more regularly than China.
Well, speaking of which, so I told you before we started recording, I'm staying in Fife. Well, I'm living with my girlfriend, who is a recently completed PhD student at St Andrews, so Scotland's English treaty port. And when you take a trip to St Andrews, which we're doing occasionally before lockdown, you would hear the conversations of some of these people, and almost always guys. And even if they look like 18 or 19, like once or twice, once we literally, as we sat down, we saw a couple of pretty young lads standing up, and like their way of saying goodbye was shaking hands and saying, looking forward to a good Brexit then. And it's like, damn, where have I gone? I'm only 10 miles from Dundee. But
I did a project last year for Audible, the online people. online books people. It was an Audible original called Murders of Old China, and it went back and it looked at various murder cases from this period. And there were usually some racial component to it. That Chinese was the major witness, or Chinese was the victim, or the accused, or whatever. And it was interesting how many times, some foreigner or another had taken it upon himself to beat up a rickshaw person. And again, that kind of, they would often, the idea that they would tip largely, but then argue the toss about the actual fare is a good one. The Chinese used to be very funny, and if they thought a foreigner was fat, which they mostly thought most foreign men were fat, they would try and charge them more, right? Because obviously it's a heavier load if you're a rickshaw puller. And people would argue for half an hour about 10 cents, right? But then tip $1. I mean, that was a regular sort of back and forth. And a multiple everyday interaction between rickshaws are always very interesting, because it's one of the biggest interactions between foreigners and Chinese that just went on thousands of times a day in Shanghai.
Right. I'm sure we could talk about rickshaws for another hour, yes. But let's keep it moving.
There's a whole book about those that you can get on the show at some point.
Yes, I'll show again.
Show,
yeah. He's coming up. Yes, okay, my turn. One thinketh and wondereth of all these things, and faileth to comprehend their whence or their whither.
O thou city that surpasseth our understanding, how impressive are thy emptiness, thy commonness, and thy bad taste.
Thou city of retired brigands, officials and generals and cheats, infested with brigands and officials and generals and cheats, who have not yet made their fortunes.
O thou the safest place in China to live in, where even thy beggars are dishonest.
And that's the end.
And of course, I mean, we should also say that, beggars in Shanghai and all of China having their own guilds, right? Their own unions, and it being a very regulated and a sort of seemingly honest trade, right? But in Shanghai, even the beggars are dishonest. So I think that's a sort of that was sort of one of those things that would probably, I don't know, like a joke about, I got in a London taxi the other day and I didn't get a racist stream of pro-Brexit nonsense. It's just like, no, that never happens, right? So it's kind of, he gets in there with a little in-joke at the end. And I think anyone reading this at the time, when he first wrote it, of course, but certainly when he translated it again, translated into Chinese, would have got all of these references and all of these in-jokes, although I believe it's actually the bits that we were talking about the strident foreigners, he actually took out in the Chinese one, because the situation had slightly changed again. And so when he wrote this, his feelings were more antagonistic towards Shanghai than when he translated it after the 1932 Japanese attack on Shanghai, when he was feeling that the settlement, the foreign concessions, had stood up and resisted that attack. And Shanghai was persevering against, perhaps, if you like, a common enemy.
Right. So that was going to be my next question about the changing times and the differences in the translation. So your way of analyzing that is that you think he's feeling a little bit more solidarity, or I don't know, just less negative feelings towards all the various foreigners. Is that an accurate characterization?
Lin Yutang has an argument with treaty ports, with extraterritoriality, with the way that many foreigners will have strided around with their white privilege and so on. He would have worried about the corruption among Chinese military leaders and politicians and so on. However, once the attack with Japan starts to happen, we start to see the kind of need for a common front, both within the Chinese, between a nationalist and communist, stopping their own internal fighting to concentrate on the fight against Japan, and that we can come back to all these issues afterwards. But if we don't defeat Japan, then it's all a moot point, right? So this has to be done first, and I think that's kind of interesting. One thing that you should note is Lin Yutang would have taken the Japanese attack in 1932 on Shanghai very, very personally. The China Critic, which of course this was originally, and so much of his work was originally published in, and where he had a column called The Little Critic, and where he was very involved with the directors and the shareholders and the other editors and writers of different publications of the commercial press, the largest press in Shanghai that had made a lot of money doing school textbooks, and had then used that money to set up many, many literary journals, and was publishing all sorts of interesting people, classics as well as new vernacular writing, translations, all of that going on through the commercial press. The commercial press building took a direct hit from a Japanese shell in 1932 and burned to the ground, including its entire library of 500,000, 500,000 books, which included irreplaceable classic texts in very, very early editions. It was all destroyed by a firebomb that just gutted the building completely. So the entire infrastructure of the China Critic, the commercial press, was basically wiped out by Japanese bombing in 1932. So he had felt very, very personally, the tragedy of the Japanese attack on Shanghai in 1932.
Right. So for all his kind of staying aloof and not strongly taking a side, here's an instance where he really feels that he is kind of involved and has to take a side.
Yes, and it really ramps up his feelings. Of course, he leaves China in 1936 to go to America. And when he's there, he spends so much of his time trying to explain the Chinese struggle, the Chinese cause to America through those two novels, which, of course, I'm going to forget the names of. He forgets one's very good.
Moment in Peking?
Not so good. Yeah, Moment in Peking, which is a very good kind of, family saga that takes us up to 1937. And it's a paean to Peking as well. And then the other one that he wrote, which came just after it, which I'm going to forget now as well. Leaf in the Storm. In the Storm,
yes.
Yeah, which he wrote in 1941 and published. And that's not, it's a slightly more formulaic book, but again, it's about the struggle of China from 1937. And of course, reinforcing to a Western audience in a genre that they like, the kind of family saga, the idea of generations all living together. I mean, that's a very popular one in all sorts of, in all national literatures. And he's telling that story. And of course, but telling the story of China's struggle, the struggle of an allied nation, of course, starting from really, if you like, the summer of 1937 and the occupations of Tianjin and Beijing, and of course the bombing of Shanghai, and then moving on to the roll up the Yangtze, the terrible rape of Nanjing several months afterwards, and of course eventually the removal of the Chinese government to Chongqing, and then, total all-out war in 1937. 2 years before, just 2 years before, Britain goes to war in Europe. And of course, several years before, December 1941, America goes to war with Japan. So, there's that whole period when he is very much agitating, as are many Chinese around the world, support for the Chinese cause against Japan, which worked reasonably well, both in the UK and the US and elsewhere. And those novels were part of that, his telling of those stories, just good family saga novels that people go and borrow from their library or buy in their local bookshop, and giving them a good strength. And I think this partly came as well from his friendship with Pearl Buck, who of course has always written more in that genre. And so he moves more into that genre, both explaining the nation, the importance of living, the wisdom of Confucius. These are books that he writes. He then writes another book during the war about the wisdom of China and India, looking at the transition of Buddhism from India to China and so on. Vigil of a Nation, which is about, the ability to hold out throughout all of this. He is publishing many of these things. He writes other things after the war, some novelettes. He starts retelling classic stories for a Western audience. He really brings Lao She to the forefront of Western readers' attention as well, with a sort of biography and a book about him, writing about all sorts of things, and always maintaining that liberal cosmopolitan feel. He writes about Chinese ideas of art as opposed to Western ideas of art. He writes about he writes a great book called The Pleasures of a Nonconformist, which again shows his liberal cosmopolitan ways. And of course, he can have no truck really with China after 1949, and he ends up in Taiwan.
Yeah, I think I forgot to mention when we were talking about either his views or his humor, some of the stuff I that he's written, which I've read, which I've liked the most, are his ideas of the old rogue and the scamp. I think the idea of the old rogue kind of morphed into the idea of the scamp. When he's talking about the old rogue, he first tries to say it's like a trait of the kind of Chinese national character. People have criticized that and said, well, actually, no, he's more just talking about himself. And then in The Art of Living, he's mostly, when he gets to that point, he talks about the scamp instead. But the kind of person who's kind of detached is a little bit of a trickster or a jokester, and gets up to mischief sounds a bit trivial, but someone who's you're probably not going to see leading the revolution, because that's not a very scampish thing to do. I don't know if I'm a scamp, but it really speaks to me.
I think it's worth saying as well that some people not so much did, but certainly did later after his death, see him as somewhat ephemeral, somewhat on the margins of things. They sort of slightly mocked his dandy sort of way of dressing. He dressed very well. There's lots of pictures of him with ornate teacups and things like that. If you go to his house in Taiwan, Taipei, which was his last house, it's very beautiful furniture there. His bookshelves are fantastic. He was a man who knew how to live well. He had style and taste. And I think it was a style and taste that you might associate more with I don't know if you've read the Dance to the Music of Time by Anthony Powell or something like that. It's more of a classic, long-lasting timelessness of sort of inherent taste that some people have, as opposed to the vulgarity of Art Deco or the vulgarity of Art Nouveau, the vulgarity of something that's here today and gone tomorrow. There's a timelessness to his taste, but he manages to, if you go to his house in Taipei, you can see this, incorporate wonderful pieces of Western furniture with wonderful examples of traditional Chinese furniture, lacquerware, blackwood furniture, as well as good, Western sofas, which many people did at the time, because let's face it, a Western sofa is a lot more comfy than many Chinese chairs. But you need to, so he managed to do that very, very well. And I think he thought a lot about, in this way, he's quite contemporary in a sense that he thought a lot about what he ate. He thought a lot about what he drank. He thought a lot about how he approached people and spoke to people. And I think all of that sometimes was very easy to mock, particularly in the sort of 1950s and 60s when mainland China, purposefully introduced a certain coarseness into the language and into the manners such as they were. He was totally at odds. His tradition was totally at odds to that.
A couple more questions about him to Shanghai before we get on to the technical and the extra sort of questions. So a thing I noticed about him to Shanghai is it just feels very busy to be reading it, and the way the short sort of verses are broken up almost seemed to me like sort of a street by street or alley by alley view of the city. Like I was kind of picturing someone standing up on a rooftop looking down. We did kind of already analyze the poem line by line, so we've already sort of done that kind of top-down observation of the hustle and bustle. So I just want to ask you instead, have you got any favorite lines or verses in Hymn to Shanghai, just on a personal level, or your cup of tea?
Well, I like very much his references to when he refers to the V-necked Western women in evening gowns with the shop clerks at the horse racing. At the dog racing. Sorry. That's very much. If you read a lot of my work, that's what I'm trying to sort of recreate, that atmosphere. I think what's really important is we're only really just starting to understand how much writers like Lin Yutang, Lao She, Lu Xun fit into global modernism. I published a book several years ago in the Royal Asiatic Society China series by Anne Wichard of Westminster University on Lao She's time in London, and she shows that he was reading Joyce and other modernist writers, right? And that's really interesting. We don't know exactly who Lin Yutang was reading, but he had the linguistic ability to read everyone, right?
Right.
Lao She went on a pilgrimage while he was living in London. He went on a pilgrimage to Dublin to see the locations from Ulysses, for instance. So they were very aware of Western modernist writing. From the May 4th movement that one of the major things involved in that was translating writers, the Bloomsbury writers, right? Woolf, as well as Catherine Mansfield and writers like this. So people were reading all of this. They were reading Lawrence in English. He would have been able to read Lawrence. I wrote a thing about book censorship flip in Shanghai that included, Lady Chatterley's lover being censored there, but copies being available. So he's reading all of this. So there's definitely a feel. And if you look at, if you can find a copy, again, in the Royal Asiatic Society China series of Andrew Field's translations of Mu Sheying's short stories, you'll see there, and in, if you're talking about Laoshi and Cat Country, also talking about Laoshi, although it's more of a novel, Mr. Ma and Son, Urama, that within these books, there's all sorts of ideas of modernism. And here in this short piece, we get lots of the leitmotifs of modernism. Now, I'm not a modernist scholar, so I'm just going to say things like, repetition of the same phrasing, right. Coming round to people, mentioning real places, choosing things that are obviously signs of modernity, right? The pink-eyed electric rabbits, right. Chinese eating with Western cutlery, things like that, right? I mean, this is very much, the techniques of modernism that are being used everywhere. And I think historically, we've really only understood modernism as a European phenomenon with a little bit of an American offshoot, right? Well, if you learned it in Europe, I guess in America, you probably get more of an American offshoot. But we're now learning that, there were modernist writing in Latin America, parts of Africa, and also in other parts of Asia, certainly in Japan, and also, with writers like this in China, to understand that there is a global modernism, there's a global phenomenon going on here, and that often these writers are often reading each other, or at least, the Chinese or the Japanese writers are, when we talk about books about Shanghai, I can talk about Yokomitsu Raichi. They are definitely reading the Chinese writers, right? So everyone's reading everybody else, and Westerners, because their linguistic skills allow for it, and the May 4th movement has led to translations. And this becomes very important. It's only after this period that we hear people calling for literature, for the novel to be something that can be vernacular and part of the whole political, social advancement of the culture that's going on. And so I think this sits very neatly within that. Not everything Lin Yutang wrote was high modernism. He wrote all over the place. He was a jobbing writer, right? He had to make a living. But, he is obviously being influenced by modernist writing from elsewhere. We also know that, which someone else can talk about in much more detail, that the famous bookshop, whose name escapes me now, that was run by a Japanese in Shanghai, where Lu Xun and everyone went to buy their books and had salons where they sat down. He was also a Christian Japanese as well. I don't know if Lin Yutang went to that bookshop, which was in Hong Kong, but there was one of the things that's been lost in the sort of post-war political divisions and arguments that go is this great backwards and forwards and fusions and interactions between Japanese and Chinese writers, creative people, and modernity, right? Japanese and Chinese modernity. And that's been rather sidelined by post-war politics, but it was massive in the interwar period.
Was that bookshop the Uchiyama, the Uchiyama bookshop. Yeah, there's been quite a lot of work done on it, and various people. John Van Fleet at the Royal Asiatic Society in Shanghai, who is a Japanese scholar as well as a China scholar, has done quite a lot of work on it. There was a book recently about it. It's the building is still there, actually. I think like everything in Shanghai, it's a convenience store or something. I think it's an ICBC bank.
Yeah, that's it, ICBC bank with a kind of Lawson's or something next door.
Yeah,
but that's a very interesting story, and of course that relationship got very poisoned around this time because of the Japanese attacks. So that kind of fluidity of interaction that was taking place in what was called Little Tokyo, just over the Suzhou Creek in Hong Kong, and also with many people, Sun Yat-sen included, going to study in Japan, not just in America, but going to study in Japan and taking ideas from Japan about Asian modernity, Asian strength, self-strengthening movement, and all of that is coming from Japan. And that often is overlooked in analysis of what these guys and women as well were all doing at the time, right? Japan was a much bigger cultural presence in their life than it probably is for Chinese writers today.
Right, yeah, it's an interesting thing which I'd love to know more about, but don't.
We should also mention, Angus, because otherwise you'll get lots of emails on it. The other thing that Lin Yutang in America spent a long time trying to do was develop the notion of a Chinese typewriter.
Yeah.
So he tried to do this, and I'm not going to talk about that at all, because Thomas Mulaney has written a great book called The Chinese Typewriter, which is all about that. I mean, I've seen a few of them, but I don't really, it's a fascinating idea of trying to develop a way of actually having a functioning fast typewriter that can do the Chinese characters.
Yes.
It's fascinating.
Strike me down, listeners, if I forget, but I'll try and get a link to something about Lin Yutang's typewriter work in the show notes. There was something I was going to say. This is not strictly very relevant, and I don't know if this is relevant to modernism, but since we're talking about liqueur and cat country, and you mentioned Japanese writing about the same time, have you heard of a Japanese book whose English name is I Am a Cat by Natsume Soseki?
I have heard of it, but I'm afraid I've never read it.
It's the only Japanese thing from this sort of era I've read, and I don't know if it would be qualified as modernist, but it's kind of about modernizing Japan, societal norms, and kind of the ridiculousness of some family dynamics. But the interesting spin is it's all told from the point of view of a cat, and the cat thinks a lot of itself. It's a cat that thinks it's amazing, as all cats do.
And recently there was a book published by a Western writer, Nick Bradley, who's lived in Tokyo a long time, called The Cat and the City, which does a similar thing for contemporary Tokyo.
Cool. So if listeners know anything about such things, please do get in touch. Last question about Him to Shanghai here. When you read it, what emotions do you feel? Or to phrase the question another way, what emotions do you see kind of injected into Him to Shanghai? Like, is it all disgust? Is there any admiration? Is there anything else in there? Or what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think you can criticize things a lot, but still quite like them, can't you, really? I mean, you can talk about the sin of young people doing drugs and having casual sex and drinking all night and going out to nightclubs. And isn't that really awful? And then think, wow, Anyway, I did, but I think for me as a writer, it's a very good reminder. I look at it quite often. I look at that and I put it alongside a piece by Langston Hughes, who, of course, the great Harlem Renaissance poet, who visited Shanghai around the mid-1930s. I've written about him in my collection of essays, Destination Shanghai, about the time he spent in Shanghai, at the Cannydrome, at the dog racing track, largely, because there was American jazz going on there, and how he mixed with a woman called Irene West, who rather fascinatingly was a white woman who booked lots of the jazz bands to come to Shanghai. And he was able to sit in the gardens of the Cannydrome and have a drink and talk to her, and no one worried about it because there wasn't any official color bar, segregation in Shanghai. That's not to say that American soldiers didn't cause trouble sometimes, or that hotels, including the YMCA, didn't sometimes refuse black guests, but he felt, this was very different to being in America. He wrote a poem later when he got back to America after Japan invaded the 1937 invasion, called Raw China. It's very easy to find online. Raw as in a lion's roar.
Right.
And in it, he talks about all the things he didn't like about Shanghai, all the things that were problems. The hotels that wouldn't let a black man stay there, the other problems that he had, things that annoyed him about the colonial divisions in Shanghai. But then he also talks about, but this city is now under attack by Japan. It's not a long poem, but it's a very powerful poem. And it stands as an interesting counterpoint to Lin Yutang's Hymn for Shanghai, and that it is calling for a support for Shanghai. In fact, Hughes's poem, I think, was first published in the New Masses, which was the newspaper of the American Communist Party, and it is not afraid to criticize Shanghai, yet it recognizes that there is a greater danger to the city. The idea is, of course, you have to resist that danger and come out of that to create something better, newer, something that is greater. And of course, that's an idea that's very much with us at the moment, with the pandemic and with Black Lives Matter and other things, that we're going through a bad time. We have to be open and we have to be critical. But the idea of all of that is that we come out of this stronger and with better ideas. Now, whether or not that happens is another thing. But, that's sort of an idea that's with us now. And I think, look up Langston Hughes's poem and take a moment to read that. That's a very interesting counterpoint.
Well said. So now I'm going to jump to some technical questions about the piece. These were going to be sort of translation related questions, although we've basically answered them all already. So I'm going to switch things up a little bit and just ask sort of more broad, in quotes, cultural sort of or historical sort of questions. originally I was going to ask what changed between 1930 and 1933, between the English and Chinese edition. We've covered that already. So I thought instead I'd ask, what do you think remains the same in today's Shanghai? Is there anything in Hymn to Shanghai Lin is describing which still fundamentally applies today, or is it all gone?
Well, I think I sort of answered that before, in the sense that, you know, if you want to understand why Shanghai looks like it does, parts of it, but also the new parts of it. And if you want to understand why the Shanghainese arguably have this terrible reputation in the rest of China for being rather money grabbing and rather vulgar in their looks, you know, in their love of luxury brands and flashy nightclubs and flashy hotels, and the verticality of Art Deco, you know, this idea that tallest is best, right? All of those ideas are still really the Jing Pai versus the Hai Pai, right? And many, many people in Shanghai still embrace all of those, to use Lin Yutang's terms, vulgarities, right? And that's okay. I mean, we look at every society in the world. There are people who embrace the vulgar notion of things, right? I mean, Kardashians, you know. So this always happens, and it's very interesting that this is a great melting pot of Chinese people. Let's forget the foreigners from one side, but remember, Shanghainese people, you know, they don't often go back more than 3 or 4 generations, right? I mean, they're from somewhere else, and that can be as far south as Guangdong, and you know, certainly inland a fair way. But they have all merged and mixed in a certain way, and out of that has come Shanghai Hua and Shanghai dialect, and you know, there has come a common culture. And a common way of communicating, and a common way of really viewing the world, I think, that is still identifiably Shanghainese. And a lot of that with a sort of a love of wealth and the showiness of wealth, which is called by people, I think, who've only just encountered Shanghai, oh, well, aren't the Shanghai nouveau riche? Well, no, they're not nouveau riche now, because that's kind of China. That's the last vestige of China old money from before the revolution. Right? You know, it's kind of, you know, built itself up that way. So it's not really a kind of nouveau riche. It's just a rediscovery of a tradition that lived before. We could argue that there was always another tradition there. I mean, if you think of Zhao Xunmei, the poet, right? Who ended up, you know, having the relationship with Emily Hahn, and they created literary journals and everything. I mean, he always lived in a kind of a courtyard house, not quite a Peking courtyard house, but a sort of a courtyard house. Never lived in modern apartment blocks and so on. So before 1949, there was an older Shanghai, a more ancient sort of moneyed culture, mostly around the old town and things like that. Nowadays, people think of the old town as being the poorest part of the city, and, you know, very run down, what's left of it, and falling apart. But of course, there's some beautiful low-level properties that predate the treaty port era, still just about left there. So that's kind of worth remembering. And then this new Shanghai notion of being Shanghainese comes on top of that, ignoring the foreigners. And, you know, that becomes something that I think you can still sort of see very strongly in Shanghai tastes, and what sort of things they favor in terms of fashion and culture. You know, those things are still very important, even in a very, very changed China.
So unsurprisingly, in the last answer and throughout the whole episode, interview, whatever, we've been talking a lot about cultural mixture, or hi-pi, or maybe the term I like to use these days is cultural exchange. Just seems very wholesome to me, that phrase, cultural exchange. So, but whatever term we use, do you think the nature of cultural mixing or exchange has, well, I know it's changed, but do you think is exchange or mixing of cultures still as kind of rich and important as it used to be, as well as having kind of shifted with the changing times in Shanghai, or just universally?
I think that Shanghai is still very, very good, as are port cities around the world. I think that the fact that Shanghai is a port should never be forgotten. Cities like that are very, very good at taking the best from everything that passes by. Now, of course, you know, if you're an extreme nationalist, or you're prejudiced in some way, you're not going to agree with this. But I would argue that, you know, my own city, London, you know, has thrived and is stronger and is a world city because it has, you know, largely taken in the world in various forms, right? And in forms of different culture, different people, different beliefs. And so therefore, and been very tolerant of them. Now, we may be going through a slightly less tolerant period at the moment, but in general, over a sort of 200-300 years, it's become a global city that way. And Shanghai, similarly at that time, that process happened in Shanghai. Now, whether the origins of that process are very good, colonialism and being forced to open up, or even in London, uber capitalism, to which there are many losers and few winners, this can all be argued. What it does, though, is create cities with an identifiable culture and a sense of that. And I think that's sort of rather important in trying to understand why Shanghai is Shanghai in the way that we might try and understand, why is London, London, Paris, Paris, New York, New York, Tokyo, Tokyo. All of these things are quite important. It's interesting at the moment that, you could argue now that, well, they're trying to stop certain things coming into Shanghai, internet controls and so on, but there were always controls. In the nationalist regime, films were always censored, whether if it was because they felt they showed a bad impression of China, or they offended one or other group within the international settlement. Books, similarly, were always censored. I mentioned Lady Chatterley's Lovers. I mean, in the Royal Asiatic Society Journal several years ago, I wrote about a whole police crackdown on Western literature by Western police, right? Largely, any Western literature, I tried to work out what the common thread was for books that were banned. And actually, Professor Robert Bickers answered the question, which was any book like Lady Chatterley's Lover that shows a middle class or bourgeois Western woman succumbing to the temptations of the flesh, shall we say, was a bad idea, because Chinese people like Lin Yutang could read that and would diminish the Western woman in the eyes of the Chinese. So that's why it was going on then. So of course the reasons for censoring change, but censorship has been a constant all the way through China's history. What was interesting about Shanghai before 1949 was that, of course, it was very difficult to censor anything within the concession. So Nanjing was always looking to censor things. I don't know, anime Wong films, various other things. They would be able to censor it in most parts of China, but they couldn't necessarily do it in the concession. But the concession itself would censor some things over others. So all sorts of stuff is going on. But in general, it's a very legally light regime, which is why most of your Chinese newspapers are based there. Most of your Chinese writers are living and working there. Your Chinese film studios are there. And again, this is that contradiction between a city that is created really through colonialism and violence, right? That also then becomes a refuge for creative people, for journalists, for artists, for writers, for filmmakers. And that's one of the great contradictions of Shanghai.
Right. And I guess we could say, so long as there's censorship, there are ways around censorship. And today it's I guess, VPNs, and there would have been... Yeah,
well, for many Chinese people, for many Chinese newspaper owners, the way around censorship in China was to base yourself in Shanghai, i.e. beyond Chinese law, right? So if you're a Chinese film studio, you could still make your films without any interference. The Chinese government could then interfere with them perhaps when they tried to show them at cinemas, but at least they got made. So and at least people like, the writers could sort of move around freely without risk of a knock on the door at any time. But of course, it was an unsatisfactory situation. It wasn't one that people wanted to be permanent. But, don't forget, the Communist Party of China was formed in the French concession, right? Because they would have probably all been arrested immediately outside of the French concession, right? So you can even use treaty ports. You use, in the way that you use VPNs or the way that Hong Kong used to be used or whatever, right? You have to find new ways around these. And Shanghai was a way around things for many Chinese in those days.
I was trying to think of a reason to bring up St. Andrews again, and that's actually made me think the idea of like one set of laws being transplanted to another place. So I was making fun of St. Andrews before, calling it an English treaty port. I'd left out the biggest kind of quote unquote foreign population, the Americans. It's kind of an American zone as well. And that apparently has been a source of drama. I don't know if it was this year or recent years, where a fraternity got in trouble. So this is like the American frat boy thing, where in that strange country, these lads engage in horribly toxic laddish behavior, and it's kind of institutionalized in these fraternity societies. And this I think it wasn't the university. The university doesn't want to cut off their supply of American tuition fees, but basically some frat boys operating in St Andrews did some awful stuff, and there was calls for their fraternity to be shut down, and they said no, like we have a right to operate here. But then it raises the question of why should an American organization have these chapters in other universities in other countries? I mean, I know analogies are a muddy business, and I don't want to say this is the same as foreign powers in Shanghai, but I feel like in some ways these things are endlessly interesting and tricky to get your head around.
Well, I'd say several things. One is you better back off from St Andrews, I think, because they've just put a lot of money into a new China centre up there.
Yes.
With lots of things with Professor Gregory Lee moving to run it. So, we're all kind of looking forward to great things from St Andrews at the moment. That's the first thing. Secondly, people have always got around different laws and used these things selectively. In Shanghai, as I said, in the international settlement, you had extraterritoriality, whereby you were subject to the laws of your own country. But of course, you were living alongside all sorts of other countries who had very different laws. So the most obvious one was when America introduced prohibition, right? The Volstead Act that meant you couldn't drink alcohol. That technically applied to every American in Shanghai. But not one American judge or American institution tried to stop Americans from drinking in Shanghai, where obviously, everybody else, Chinese and foreign, was merrily going along drinking whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, right? So they sort of even then were selected. I don't think anybody in Washington ever got onto. There might have been some missionaries or so on, but there was obviously a temperance league. But nobody tried to walk into a nightclub in Shanghai and say, right, all the British and French over there drinking whiskey and wine, no problem, right? The Americans over here, give them all a Coca-Cola and an orange juice, right? I mean, it wasn't. No way. It wasn't good. That was never going to work. So it never happened. And there's a very funny story once of the Shanghai Express, the train that went between Shanghai and Beijing, obviously famous for the Marlene Dietrich Anna May Wong film, was often treated as an international zone. And there was once a delegation of visiting American congressmen during the Prohibition era, and they got on the train in Shanghai heading towards Beijing. And as soon as the train took off, they decided to head down to the bar, right? Because this is great. We can drink on a train. We used to be able to do that in America. Now we can't. The Chinese, not wishing to insult their American guests, closed the bar because they didn't want the Americans to feel that they would be tempted to break their own laws. And it eventually involved the Americans having to find an Englishman to go there and demand that the bar was open, because prohibition wasn't his bloody law, right? And he got it open, and then they all managed to drink all the way to Peking. But it was, so there were always very funny things going on. And to go back to your point about why read Lin Yutang, this is a very important point. I'm always very conscious when I write anything that I write about Shanghai, and I write about the foreigners in Shanghai. That's my kind of groove, the sort of furrow that I plow. And I like doing it, and it has good audiences. It's all translated into Chinese. I have quite a nice big readership in China that's very interested in all of this stuff, and finds it another aspect of their own history that maybe they don't get from other books, whether it's, unsolved murders in Beijing in the 1930s or foreign gangsters in Shanghai. And I'm always very careful that, you need to balance a certain amount of nostalgia with a certain amount of reality. Right?
Yeah.
And that always needs to be looked at. And I don't think, I think I get an okay balance. I work very hard to try and get that balance. And I'm reasonably dismissive of a lot of the old Shanghai books that are just pure nostalgia and don't balance that against the social conditions that are going on at the time. Right. I probably have a better way of getting around it in that I tend to focus on those foreigners who've been forgotten in the traditional narratives of old Shanghai. So not the wealthy and the diplomats and the missionaries and the businessmen. I tend to focus on the showgirls and the prostitutes and the gangsters and the refugees, right? So I'm kind of down on the social scale anyway. So maybe it's easier to balance it with the situation for, the vast majority of Shanghai, which is poor Chinese, right? So, and I think Lin Yutang, as with Raw China by Langston Hughes that I mentioned, reminds me every time I read it that there is this, that we have to get this balance of what's going on right when we look at Old Shanghai.
Totally. It's a thing it's not exactly the same, but a very similar thing I bump up against on the podcast is wanting to be very chatty and casual, but swiftly realizing I do have to be sensitive because it's hard not to run into some sort of a sensitive issue talking about Chinese literature, history, culture. There's just lots of ways you can be a prat, basically. So the balance for me is being fun, but not being, careless and stupid and insensitive. And it's great that you've struck a balance.
I mean, I take a lot from, obviously, I show all my work to people whose views I value, but also all of my work, because it mostly goes straight into Chinese, gets sent to my Chinese publisher the same day it gets sent to my UK and American publishers.
Right.
And, I've had the same publisher in China for quite a long time. He's a very big publisher. He's, I think, got very good taste. But by which I mean that I think there's lots of books about China he could publish, and some he does and some he doesn't. And I think, I think he would tell me if he was finding anything there that's annoying. I mean, I know that there's nothing really to annoy the government as such, because I'm writing about a different time and different sorts of things.
Right.
It's really about whether or not, you're tending to forget one group over another group or whatever. His general feeling is that it kind of shines a light on different aspects of Chinese history, and in Shanghai, and both Shanghai and Peking now, I have famous, I think they're famous walking tours of the sites of City of Devils, and a long-running one in Beijing of the sites of Midnight in Peking, which has gone on and started off with sort of foreigners who'd read the book, expats who live there who were interested to see things, but also now Chinese groups doing that as well.
Cool.
So that's kind of how I figure I'm getting it right. I'm much more keen to read my reviews on Weibo and WeChat than I am on Amazon. I mean, I read the ones on Amazon as well, but even the 1-star ones. But it's like I'm very interested in what Chinese audience feels, and a lot of the time when I'm going around China, because I lived there for a long time, obviously, and know a lot of people, I do book tours around China, and it's always really fascinating to meet with Chinese audiences, particularly if they've had the chance to read the book. And I always find that's sort of one of the most interesting groups of readers I can meet. A lot of the time when I'm going on book tour around America or somewhere, it's very much almost like giving lectures about Shanghai. There's this place, it was this, it was that. I don't have to do a lot of that in China. And it's kind of fascinating to watch people rediscovering their own history and watching a Chinese audience sort of interpret, what I am writing about, how I see Shanghai and how they see Shanghai is, sometimes the same, sometimes different. And those areas of difference and similarity are fascinating.
Totally. As you were kind of relaying to me some of the stories, I was thinking of Chinese people I knew. There were two colleagues in particular. There was the librarian at the school I worked at. He would often talk about the kind of family he was descended from, who were apparently members of the walled city of Old Shanghai since forever. So he was very proud to be Shanghainese with a capital S in bold. And there was another lady who was one of the primary school teachers, and she was Chinese. Looking at her, you would just be seeing a normal Chinese woman. But just, I forget why it came up in conversation, but she happened to mention one time that one of her grandparents was Russian, and he'd come over, I guess, fleeing the Russian Civil War or something, and proceeded to tell the story of how her grandfather learned not Mandarin but Shanghainese and became just a normal Shikuman resident and would play mahjong with all the other Shanghainese people. And yeah, it's not so extraordinary that I bumped into people like this in Shanghai. It's just part of the fabric of the city. So it's great that you're able to talk about people who might have their own stories related to the things that you've been researching and writing about.
It was certainly something I liked about Shanghai when I first went there. Which is a long, long time ago now, was that it was something that, I mean, when you go somewhere and it's very, very strange and you're not quite sure if you're going to be happy there, you kind of look for similarities with where you come from and what you do. And one of the things about where I came from in North London is it's probably the most, it is the most multicultural part of the country. And so I grew up in an extremely multicultural environment with people from all sorts of backgrounds. And so all of that sort of multiculturalism comes very naturally to me because I sort of grew up with it, and I sort of, jumped in with both feet rather than resisting it. I liked it. So when I went to Shanghai and I started meeting people, and when you got talking to people who would be like, oh, my grandfather was from Guangzhou and came here as a tailor, or I was from Xiamen, came here to run a restaurant, was from Jiangsu and came here to do nothing particularly, and also, of course, at the time that I was first there in the 90s was really when the whole migrant worker thing was really getting going in China. So the city was having this new influx of people from all over again, but particularly from Jiangsu and around
Anhui.
Yeah, and Anhui. And this process was happening again, and it was sort of interesting to see that here was this new lot coming in, encountering sometimes a little bit of hostility, a little bit of snobbishness, a little bit of resistance from those that saw themselves as Shanghainese, who at lunchtime were proudly telling me about how they were really one or two generations back from Guangdong, and look, they still spoke Cantonese with grandma or whatever, right? So that felt to me sort of very familiar to coming from somewhere like North London, where lots of people were first or second generation something or other, right? Whether it be Caribbean or Indian, South Asian, or my area as well, just Jewish, whatever, right? It was that kind of everyone thrown together, and layered on top of that is the fact that everyone was kind of London, right?
Right.
And I kind of felt that was sort of hopefully what would happen. What had happened in Shanghai had happened, but hopefully would happen again with this new influx of migrant workers that were coming in and were hopefully going to marry and settle and have children and find success, and that they too would be the next layer of the sort of fascinating blancmange of Shanghai.
Okay, last of these kind of cultural sort of questions. It's another, keeping the geographic theme going. So you mentioned before that you always felt it was kind of stupid when these Western scholars would fixate on like Shanghai versus Beijing. But we also kind of talked about how Lin Yutang was torn, or maybe torn is too dramatic, kind of going back and forth between Shanghai Haipai and Beijing Jingpai. So I guess the question here is, how helpful or useful or attached to reality is it to view Shanghai and Beijing as like polar opposites?
Well, I think that there are some reasons that become apparent to me in my research that sometimes just strike you and you think, why didn't I realize that before? I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Destination Shanghai, which was about lots of different foreigners that came to Shanghai. Some you'll have heard of, but didn't associate with Shanghai, like Eugene O'Neill or Langston Hughes or something like that. Others you've never heard of. And I did another book that I've just finished and sent off to the publishers called Destination Peking, which is another group of foreigners who lived in Beijing. And the group of foreigners that interest me very much in Beijing are the aesthete, mostly English and American aesthetes. And many of them were gay men. And I was always trying to work out, why was there this gay male community in Beijing? But of all the work I've done, and I've probably done more work on the underworld of Shanghai than anyone really, particularly the foreign underworld of Shanghai, I've come across every kind of thing going, but I never come across a gay club. Right? No one ever mentions it. And I thought, okay, so what's going on here? And I don't know why. It took me a long time. And I suddenly worked out that, of course, it's extraterritoriality. So I went to all these things of like, oh, well, gay men are more aesthetic, right? They liked the hutongs and the eaved roofs and the swallows with flutes and things like that. But, that's not a very good reason. The reason was that if you were English and gay or American and gay, and you were in Shanghai and you were caught for something like that, you were prosecuted, right? Unnatural acts, buggery, whatever the charge would be. But in Beijing, although there wasn't really, the laws were a little bit more fluid on things like that. It wasn't really, it wasn't that it was necessarily, there were laws promoting it, but you could kind of get away with it. So I think that's why we saw, for instance, aesthetes gather in Beijing more than Shanghai. So sometimes, the reasons why people went to certain places were governed by the system, the political and social system that's in place there. And I think that's sort of interesting. So many people who And of course, if you really wanted to do business, you ended up going to Shanghai. If you were more interested, many of the sort of people that we find that are collectors or specialists in pottery or ceramics or textiles or something, they tend to end up in Beijing. And of course, nowadays we've layered another layer onto it, which is, when I first got to Beijing, late 80s, here I was wanting to find the Beijing of Harold Acton and Peonies and Ponies, his great comic novel of Beijing. And of course, what I found was a lot of, what they used to call Stalinist wedding cakes, right? These Russian Stalinist buildings around. And of course, I forgot that there was this whole school of communist architecture, which had been dumped on top of old Beijing. Well, of course, you can still find, or you certainly could then, now just about find some hutongs. So all of that was wonderful. Shanghai is wonderful. I just wish that whole argument would go away, and people, I don't understand why people get involved in it. It's a nonsensical argument. Both cities have their own histories. They've grown up the way that they have. If you're Chinese, there might be a good argument to have, but as a foreigner, there really isn't. And if you're favoring one over the other, I just think it's because you haven't learned enough about the other, if you see what I mean.
It's was it you were saying earlier, like people who side with the place just because they have lived there or were born there? It's kind of like primary school level.
Everyone does it. I used to be driven mad when I was a student in London, and every year Time Out magazine in London would do 2 covers that they would send to every newsagent. One would be a person in a T-shirt saying "I love North London," and the other would be a person in a T-shirt saying "I love South London." And I would go in as North London born and bred. 4 or 5 generations, something like that. I would go into college and I'd have people who'd moved from, I don't know, Liverpool or Manchester, and just by chance, had got a room in a shared house in Peckham, and they'd be, "I love South London." I'd be like, that's just, North London's rubbish, South London's great. So, and you just be like, it's not your fight. It's not your business. Keep out of it. So, it's kind of, people, I went to Glasgow at university and suddenly walked into an argument about, whether people are from the South Side or the East End and all, not my argument, right? So it's kind of, it's bizarre, but it's obviously something that happens everywhere. But it's bizarre that people should drop in, usually by chance in one place or the other, and then suddenly decide that, I suppose people always want verification that they've made the right decision.
That's reminded me, this is not really an analogy at all, it's just something that's reminded me. It's about St Andrews again. So I was kind of horrified.
I told you about the St Andrews thing. We can't they've got a Chinese department now. We've got to support them.
This one's about the students, not about the uni. But yeah, Gregory Lee, if you're listening, just, come get me. If you want to tell me off, fine. But yeah, I was horrified to learn
I'm
from my
personally not
girlfriend.
going that far north, but
Yeah, well, the wastelands of Fife are an interesting place. But yeah, my girlfriend told me that this kind of residential suburban areas of St Andrews, where a lot of the students will stay if they leave halls. So this is where like the normal people live, the people who aren't attached to the university. This is just their normal suburban neighborhood. It's a pretty normal Scottish suburb, but the students of St Andrews refer to it as the Badlands. And I heard that, I was like, what?
Yeah.
No, that's just a normal neighborhood. But who am I to tell them? Okay, ending on that very silly note, let's go on to our kind of more lighthearted questions. I actually forgot to put these in our list of questions, but they're pretty easy. One was, what's our word of the day going to be? I know you already suggested the word for vulgarity in Chinese, so we can maybe do that one.
No,
unless you've got
I'll
another
tell you
one.
what I'm going to do. I'm going to do one. Let me just check it.
Okay.
Because it's not a word anyone will know, but it's a word everyone would have known at that time. Hang on.
Right.
And I used it in my Audible original. And I just need to call that up just to check what it is. Where is it? Final edit. If you're an Audible account, by the way, you should get that. It's good fun.
What is it?
It's called Murders of Old China. It's 12 murders that took place in the first half of the 20th century in China. And I go back and reinvestigate them. And it's just for Audible,
Listeners, take note.
Okay, so into war Shanghai, of course, the major way to get around was by rickshaw. And rickshaws were pulled by, obviously, Chinese. In fact, at one point, some very poor Russian men tried to become rickshaw pullers, and the municipal council wouldn't allow it because they felt it would denigrate the white man in the eye of the Chinese. Anyway, there's lots of words that people who don't speak Chinese or haven't studied Chinese but end up in China sort of know, right? So, within a few weeks, people know how to call a taxi and how to tell it to turn right, turn left, things like that. And you have lots of phrases like sort of junta, these sort of phrases that come about, and people sort of know them even if they don't speak Chinese. Okay. There are words that every foreigner would have known, and one of them is huangbaoche, as in yellow carriage. And this was the word that you shouted when you wanted a rickshaw. You stood by the pavement, you put your hand out, and you shouted huangbaoche. And any passing rickshawman who didn't have a fare would pull over, sometimes several of them, and that would be how you would do it. Now, they were so commonly used, rickshaws, and they were so cheap that most foreigners would use them several times a day. So really, and all social classes of foreigners use them as well. So, and there were certain grades of rickshaw, from the slightly more rickety up to the ones with pneumatic tires and cushions and things. But all of them you shouted huangbaoche, and that was because at one point the largest rickshaw company in Shanghai, all their rickshaws were yellow color, so that was what, and it became the word for rickshaw. And I think that's a word that like nobody knows now, but every single foreigner in Shanghai would have known in, the time when Lin Yutang wrote this hymn of Shanghai. And you would have heard it multiple times every day as you walk down the street. You would have just heard people, huangbaoche, China, shouting it, and all of the rickshaws pulling over. So there were thousands, tens of thousands of rickshaws in Shanghai at that time. It was such a sort of common entry job for migrant workers coming in from the countryside. So that's my word. And I want everyone to remember, if you ever need to call a rickshaw in 1930 Shanghai, you will now know how to do it. All
right. Well, if I'm ever wandering back into the 30s in Shanghai, I will do that if it ever comes about.
I believe it's a feature on iPhone 35. You just have to live long enough to wait for it to come out.
Good. I will try not to die. Our next question is another silly question. If Hymn to Shanghai was a drink, what drink do you think it would be?
If Hymn to Shanghai was a drink, the only drink it could possibly be would be a Stenger, Stengah. The drink of Shanghai, because Shanghai is not a tropical city, was not a gin and tonic, didn't need to ward off the mosquitoes. It was a whiskey soda.
Right.
And a whiskey soda in Shanghai and throughout Asia was always known, for some reason I do not know, as a Stenger. And that was the sort of house drink of Shanghai.
It's a strange word. I can't think what the etymological root would be. Sounds almost German, maybe. Now, some final questions here. You've already recommended quite a few books for our listeners, but just here at this kind of end note, is there one or two you'd really like to recommend to people listening?
Well, I think, books on Shanghai, most people know the major books on Shanghai. And if you go online, you can find, I did a kind of 10 books on Old Shanghai for The Guardian once, and I've also done the 5 books website. I did another one there, caused some consternation by recommending Shanghai Baby by Weiwei, but I'm going to stand by that. I still think that's a good book. Only people that weren't in Shanghai in the 90s think that's a bad book. Well, there might be some who are in Shanghai in the 90s who think it's a bad book, but I mean, if you were in Shanghai in the 90s, in the slightly Wild West era of Jiang Zemin and the boom time of the city, that book really recreates it very well because she was there, right? She was a player. So that's a sort of a modern book. I mentioned Man's Fate by Andre Malraux, and I still think that's worth rereading. Sadly, no one ever made a film of that. William Goldman, who wrote a fantastic book about screenwriting, points out that it has one of the strongest openings of any novel. I'm not going to give it away, but it's a fantastic opening to the novel. Very Shanghai. And it's never been filmed. But actually, there is a script of it somewhere when Bernardo Bertolucci, 3 scripts, and we'll choose one. One, I don't know what it was. The other was one for Man's Fate. But Man's Fate is set during 1927. At that time, it was thought that politically that could be a bit problematic. And the third was a script about the Last Emperor, and they went for the Last Emperor. Man's Fate still hasn't been made. So I'm going to recommend a book that I think is an interesting one, having read Hymn of Shanghai. It's by a Japanese writer called Yokomitsu Raichi. Riichi, and it's just called Shanghai. There is a translation of it that was done some years ago that I know you can pick up secondhand or online. Raichi was one of the new sensationalists or new sensualists of Japanese writing that was very inspirational on many Chinese writers, a form of sort of early Japanese modernism that other writers were involved in as well. He came and visited Shanghai in the 1920s, and he went away and wrote this book, Shanghai, afterwards. It's not very long. It's really a novella, and it doesn't have very precise. It's not like one of my books that has a precise, you are on the corner of Fuqiao Lu and Qiangxi Lu or something, Fuzhou Lu and Jiangsu Lu or something. It doesn't have that. It just has a feel, an air, an atmosphere of Shanghai as this Japanese man moves through it, largely through Little Tokyo and the Japanese areas of Shanghai. But it has a wonderful sort of feeling of being in a strange city where some things are so familiar, other things are so foreign, feeling at times that you're on another continent, Europe or America, but realizing that you're still in Asia, being able to drop into places that are very familiar, geisha houses, bath houses and things. But on the other side, walking out into completely Chinese streets, not understanding the local dialect, being surprised at Sikh policemen, foreigners striding around, all of that sort of thing. It's really a book about Shanghai that isn't read that often and isn't considered one of the sort of classics. It's not like Mao Dun's Midnight or one of the other by Chinese writers. So I've kind of recognized that. I think other people know most of the other major books. I mean, if you want to look for books about foreigners in Shanghai, I would say there's two novels that I think are worth digging out if you can find them. One is Emily Hahn. No one much reads Miss Jill by Emily Hahn, which is about a young American girl coming to Shanghai and falling through the cracks and ending up in a rather dissipated state. And that's a nice novel and not one of Emily Hahn's better known books. And there's another one by a man called Maurice de Cobra, who was a French writer who was an absolute bestseller in the 1930s and is very rarely read now. And he wrote about lots of places, wonderful books about Paris. He also traveled internationally and wrote books about various places. And he wrote a book called Shanghai Honeymoon, which sounds very frivolous, has one of the best descriptions of Shanghai in its opening 2 pages, and then goes on to tell the story of a mother and her daughter that get sort of stranded in Shanghai and again have to sort of find a way to survive. And it's about foreigners in Shanghai. I recommend ones that are about foreigners in Shanghai because I think other people will have talked about Chinese writing on Shanghai. So that's 2 by a Frenchman, an American, and a Japanese.
Awesome. Thank you for all those recommendations. I'll be sure to get those all into the show notes. Funny you mentioned Shanghai Baby. This one's been on my mind because two of the first 3 episodes I did, one was on Wang Shuo, one was on Murong Xue Cun, and I've kind of had this continued interest in writers like that, sort of like literary bad boys who were, especially I think those 2 writing around, I guess spanning from like the 80s. So this kind of period in modern China was a little bit more unhinged than it is now. And I always thought, as much as I enjoy reading these books, they're all kind of books of men behaving badly by men. So I was interested in hearing about Shanghai Baby, which from what I've gathered seems to be a similar sort of tale of like bad behavior, but it's by a woman and the main character's a woman. But yeah, I'm not trying to grill you on that or anything, but maybe just for listeners.
This is the way I would describe it. There are books about a certain time, a place and a period that don't necessarily appeal to the contemporary reader unless they want to read about that time and period. And there are also books that were incredibly widely read at the time that then don't get read very widely. And I think of a time when everyone, absolutely, I mean, I don't want to give my age away, though it is pretty ancient now. There was a time when everybody had a copy of Jay McKinnon's Bright Lights, Big City. And there was a time when everybody had a copy of Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho. Those 2 books sat together on a shelf. Those 2 writers were very closely associated. If you go back and read either of those books, if you knew New York at that time, America at that time, it's incredibly atmospheric. But I'm not sure that a young person who would have been when those books came out, at school, even if they were born, quite honestly now, they may go to that book and find it very problematic, find it confusing, perhaps, wonder what all the fuss was about, right? And I think you can go back to a time and you can take Weiwei's Shanghai Baby, which is a reasonably ephemeral book because it is about a moment. It's about an ephemeral moment in an ephemeral city lived by ephemeral people, right? And I include myself in that because it was not a group of people who were looking to the future. It wasn't a group of people who were trying to chart China's destiny or anything. It was a group of people who, for random reasons, on the Chinese side of birth largely, on our side just what option you did at university or just who offered you a job somewhere, had ended up in Shanghai at one of the sort of craziest times, right, in the Jiang Zemin go-go 90s. There was no, and we're young, right? So living like young people with all the things that young people do, but suddenly in a place where that was possible, and it hadn't been possible before, not for several decades anyway.
Right.
And I think if you put that book with Mian Mian's book, Candy, which is not strictly about Shanghai, but is about and is a slightly more thoughtful and slightly better written book as well. I think, if you read those two, I'd be very interested to see what people make of them. But as I've argued with other people who ask me to choose their books, and they say, well, Mian Mian's a terrible book, it's rubbish, I don't like it, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but you were at primary school when all this was going on, right? It's not your moment, right? So it's very difficult for you to critique that moment. Do you know what I mean? So yes, you could say Weiwei's Shanghai Baby is an ephemeral book, but this was an ephemeral time of ephemeral people, but it very brilliantly captures that period, I think. It may not be a period you approve of. I mean, the person that I was talking to was a rather young person who was very keen on China and being very serious about it all, and hadn't themselves spent their 20s largely drunken on drugs, right? Like most of us. So it was kind of, he hadn't really experienced a China that was ever like that. Right? He also spent all of his China time in Beijing. So it was always slightly more slightly more kind of like, about pints of Yanjing and things like that. Not really about and if you went to a nightclub, it was a massive, great barnyard of a Chinese nightclub. It wasn't a kind of small, underground, very mixed, mashed up kind of place. It was just a different sort of world, and maybe not a very appealing world of Fuerdi and, people ordering Jack Daniels by the bottle and stuff. I mean, this wasn't what it was like in the 90s in Shanghai. It was much more rough and ready. And so he wasn't really able to understand that. And he also wasn't really taking the book as a historical document. He was trying to judge it through his own lens. And that's kind of wrong. And same as when we look at Lin Yutang, we have to try and look through the lens of Lin Yutang, looking at Art Deco architecture, looking at foreigners walk past him, looking at the Japanese and what they're doing to his city. If we don't understand it through his eyes, we're just not going to understand it at all. And it's the same with books of any period.
Would you like to know how old I was when Shanghai Baby was published in its original Chinese?
Go on.
I was 6.
Yeah, there you go, see? So, well, I mean, I'll give it away. I was born in 1966, so I've just turned 54, right? So I wasn't, that was a real heyday for me, but I was lucky that it was the bridge with me. I had some of the kind of, craziness of the 80s in London, and then straight into the craziness of the 90s in Shanghai. I kind of got an extended decade that way.
There you go. That's a good deal.
Yeah.
Final question for you.
I also got double the amount of synth music though, so it wasn't necessarily.
Oh no. Well, every cloud has its dark grey lining. What are you reading just now? That's the last question.
Well, I tend to I either read what I'm reviewing, which is boring usually. It was boring to talk about, so you can read the reviews. I kind of read people who I hope will inspire me. I read people who I think who are doing exactly what I want to do. And I don't read them because I want to copy them, and I don't really think that happens. But I read them to try and see what it is that they're doing. At the moment, I'm on a massive kind of lockdown reread of Raymond Chandler. I'm just doing Chandler from book 1 all the way through. I should say I'm writing a book at the moment about Shanghai in the last few years, so 1947 to 49, which sort of is basically a book about what happened to everyone, how they got out or how they didn't get out. And so I want that kind of feel of the 1940s and American hard-boiled and so on. So I'm rereading Chandler and enjoying that a lot. I'm also rereading James Ellroy because he's sort of like, when I was doing City of Devils, he was very much in my mind. And I specifically didn't read him when I was doing City of Devils because I didn't want to be too influenced by books I'd read before and loved, like LA Confidential. But I very much wanted to do what he did in LA Confidential, which was to tell the underground history of a city from a point of fascination with that city, but not tell it through the eyes of the wealthy and the privileged. Tell it through the eyes of the struggling and those that had to sort of fight the foreigners, in this case, gangsters and so on. And the other person,
sorry, go on.
The other person I like a lot is Alan First, who's an American who writes usually about pre-war France and the coming of fascism, and they're espionage novels. But I like him a lot because he's a very good example of how to weave in lots of research without overloading and boring the reader, but they still get a great feel, the atmosphere again of occupied Paris. And I very much want to do that, because what I like about First as well is that he manages to write books that have tension and even though that the Nazis are going to invade and occupy Paris, you can't get around that. Right. And I sort of think of him a lot when I'm writing, because even though I'm telling individual stories, whether it's the murder of Pamela Werner, the escape of I just did a small book on the escape of a Jewish girl from Shanghai to Macau, or City of Devils, which is where everyone's stuck in Shanghai. You can't get away from the fact that history is moving on around your characters. The Japanese are going to invade on December the 8th. Right, that's going to happen. Shanghai is going to be bombed on August the 14th, 1937. These things are going to happen, and there's nothing you can do about it. So finding how you can maintain the reader's interest in the individual stories when they know what's coming. Right, I'm not doing alt history or anything like that. They know what's coming is a trick that I think Alan First does very well.
You're mentioning Raymond Chandler reminded me of something I was thinking about in the shower quite often, but forgot to put down in a list of questions. And I think I don't want to extend the episode much further than we already have, but this is too good not to ask you. We've talked about Shanghai as an Art Deco city, modernist city, cultural mix, like melting pot city. What about Shanghai is a film noir city?
Well, absolutely. I mean, my City of Devils book is called a Shanghai noir, and I'm sort of fascinated by the idea that noir, of course, in Los Angeles is largely the product of Jewish German exiles, right? That's why it's always raining in noir films, but it very rarely ever rains in Los Angeles.
Right.
And I spent several months last year in Los Angeles, just to get a plug in, because until pandemic came along and everything got put on hold, we're putting together scripts and everything to do a pilot of a TV show of City of Devils. But and I should have been there now doing it, right? But nothing's happened. But hopefully next year. So I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, driving around and sort of living in a regular Los Angeles house and driving a car up and down and the freeways and everything. And Los Angeles is a fascinating city with a great, fascinating history, which has been told largely in my interest by James Ellroy. But it isn't a noir city. Berlin is a noir city, Weimar, Berlin. And Shanghai is a noir city. Why is it a noir city? Well, number one, it has all kinds of weather, which is very important for the visual of it, although there is such a thing as tropical noir, I accept. But most importantly, it is a city of alienation. It is a city of balkanization. It is a city where everyone is guilty to some extent. As a foreigner in Shanghai, even as a refugee, even from fascism or from Bolshevism, you are subject to a certain element of white privilege. You can treat the Chinese in a certain way. Right. As a Chinese person, you've chosen to live outside of China in this kind of enclave, right? So nobody's innocent, right? Everybody is compromised by Shanghai itself, the city itself. And I talk a lot about this in hopefully interesting literary stylistic forms in City of Devils. The city itself is this kind of place where everyone within it is corrupted to a greater or lesser extent. Nobody is innocent. And that's noir, as opposed to Agatha Christie, where something awful happens like a murder. One person is found to have committed that murder, arrested for it, and the world is set right again. There is no setting right Shanghai. It's just what degree of badness and corruption does it tolerate, and who gets out alive.
Right. I make a little kind of episode art YouTube thumbnail for every one of these episodes. And now I'm thinking, when it comes to doing this one, I should try and get some chiaroscuro lighting simulated in Photoshop over Lin Yutang. I don't know if I've got the power to do that. But yeah, bring the German expressionist cinematography into the YouTube thumbnail. But yeah, we've been on the line quite a while now, and to be honest, I have to go get my lunch. But thank you so much for being on the show, Paul. I'm sure you've given the listeners a lot to enjoy, think about, and maybe mentally transport themselves back in time to old Lin Yutang's Old Shanghai. I really hope we've been able to do that for them.
Great. Well, I hope people read Lin Yutang. I mean, there's quite a lot of other reading recommendations, including me, in there. And you know, if you thought Art Deco was cool, I'm really, really sorry.
No, they've our listeners have now been educated. They now know how crass it is, and they're going to stop drinking gin liqueur as well.
Good, but carry on enjoying Shanghai. It's still fun.
So thank you again to Paul French for coming on the show and making me laugh so many times. I think he quite fairly describes himself as a raconteur. I think that's a good word for the man. So now's the part of the show where I give you the plugs whilst we listen to Tong Yang play 再见杰克 in the background. So if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, where I tweet things mostly about Chinese lit in translation or the show and sometimes other things, I am at Angus Likes Words. The show has its own Instagram account. Both on Twitter and on Instagram, you'll find out things before I reveal them on the show. For example, like the show topic. It's an obvious one. Other stuff too, other surprises you'll hear about first. Those are both good ways to get in touch with me too. If you'd like to raise a question or catch out something on the show that me or my guests have got wrong, those are good places to do that. Another really good place to contact me or talk to other fans of the show is Discord. On our Discord server, we've also got like dedicated channels to things like Chinese sci-fi, wuxia, you name it. It's a good place to talk about anything, and of course it's only high-end intellectuals who populate that Discord server. So if you're listening to this show, you deserve a spot among them. That is for certain. If you would like to support the show financially and keep the roof over my head, so to speak, and help pay the hosting fees, you can support the show on Patreon. I kind of already sold that to you at the start of the show. If you'd like to support the show with a one-off contribution and not have that constant monthly drain on your finances, one or two USD sapped away per month, it's a horrifying thought. If you'd like to avoid that and just contribute once, there is a website for that too. It's buymeacoffee.com/TrChFic. The Patreon as well is patreon.com/TrChFic on the end. TrChFic. But of course, money isn't really what I want from you. What I want from you is to spread the word. Tell your friends, family, or more importantly, anyone who might be interested in the show about the show. If you know anyone who you think would enjoy it, please do tell them. Also, if you know a local sticky-fingered banker or sing-song girl, or just a scamp or an old rogue, please tell them too, because, those are also great potential listeners. So off you go and do that, and until next episode, 再见.